Three shadows cut across the sun-baked Arizona dirt, moving toward the lone cabin like wolves stalking prey. Dust clung to their prison-worn boots as they eyed the small ranch with hungry desperation. A woman stood alone on the porch, her slender frame deceptively fragile against the harsh frontier backdrop. Ruby Callahan felt their eyes before she saw them, her fingers instinctively brushing against the hidden revolvers beneath her simple work dress. "Easy pickings, boys," Silas Blackwood muttered, prison brand still raw on his forearm. "Just some cowgirl alone in the middle of nowhere." The youngest, Travis, shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should move on." "Shut it," hissed Hank Butcher. Walton, revealing teeth filed to points in prison. "I ain't eaten proper in days." Ruby's eyes narrowed as she noted their approach angles, her mind calculating distances and draw times with cold precision. A smile almost ghosted across her lips. These men had broken out of Yuma prison, believing they were the most dangerous predators in the territory. They had no idea they were walking straight toward the legendary Phantom Rose, the fastest gun in the West. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn broke over Ruby Callahan's small ranch, like it had every morning for the past 3 years, with silent indifference to her solitude. She'd been up for hours already, leather-gloved hands working the corral fence, sweat dampening the back of her cotton shirt despite the early hour. The Arizona Territory wasn't kind to those who couldn't keep pace with its demands. Ruby paused, straightening her back as she surveyed her modest spread. 40 acres of stubborn earth that most folks in Copper Springs had written off as worthless. Before she arrived, now it supported a small herd of cattle, a vegetable garden that defied the climate and provided the isolation she craved. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, exactly how she wanted it. Thunder, her dappled gray stallion, nickered from the stable. Ruby smiled, a rare expression that softened the hard lines around her eyes. "Coming with your breakfast, you impatient beast," she called, her voice carrying the slight rasp of someone unaccustomed to regular conversation. The horse was more companion than livestock. When Ruby talked, which wasn't often, it was usually to Thunder. He didn't ask questions about her past, or notice how her right hand never strayed far from where her revolver would be if she were wearing it. Today, like every day, the twin Colt. Peacemakers were secured in their custom holsters, hanging from a bedpost where her fingers could find them before her eyes fully opened. 3 years of relative peace hadn't dulled her vigilance. Survival habits died hard, if they died at all. "Remember your fundamentals, Ruby girl," her father's voice echoed in her memory as she forked hay into Thunder's stall. "Speed'll get you noticed, but accuracy keeps you breathing." Sheriff Thomas Callahan had been the fastest draw in 3 counties. Before he was framed for a crime he didn't commit and hanged by corrupt men in badges. Ruby had been 15 then, watching from the crowd, her mother 5 years in the grave already. That day, something inside Ruby hardened into steel. By 16, she could outdraw her father's ghost. By 18, stories of a mysterious young shooter who appeared like a phantom and disappeared just as quickly began circulating through saloons and camps across the territory. They called this gunslinger the Phantom Rose, after the single dried rose found on the bodies of men known for their cruelty and corruption. Men like those who had murdered her father. Few knew the Phantom was a woman. Even fewer connected her to Ruby Callahan, who drifted into Copper Springs 3 years ago, purchased a struggling ranch with gold coins, and kept to herself except for necessary supply runs into town. Ruby poured water from a bucket into the trough, watching Thunder drink. Her father had started her training young, his weathered hands guiding hers around her first pistol when she was barely tall enough to see over a saloon table. "This world eats the weak, Ruby," he would tell her, eyes set on distant horizons. A woman alone needs to be twice as tough, twice as skilled, and 3 times as careful. Never let them see everything you are. She'd taken those lessons to heart. In town, she wore dresses with specially sewn hidden holsters. She kept her shooting hand gloved, hiding the calluses that might give her away. She spoke softly when forced to speak at all, letting the townsfolk dismiss her as just another widow. Trying to survive on the frontier, only when threatened did the mask slip. In 3 years, it had happened twice. The first time, 2 drunk cowhands decided the quiet woman at the edge of town needed company. They found her in the general store, cornered her by the dry goods. What they didn't see was how her stance shifted, how her eyes calculated distances, how her gloved hand hovered near the hidden slit in her dress. The second time was when Bart Jessup, the banker's son, followed her out of town, his reputation for taking what wasn't freely offered preceding him. Ruby hadn't even drawn her gun. The hunting knife strapped to her ankle had been enough to educate him on the error of his assumptions. He still walked with a limp, and his pride had taken longer to heal than his thigh. Ruby finished her morning chores as the sun climbed higher, then headed back to the cabin. It was a simple structure, but solid, built by the previous owner who'd lost his dream to a drought and his life to a rattlesnake. Ruby had added defensive improvements that weren't obvious to casual observation. Reinforced shutters that could be quickly barred, strategic firing ports disguised as ventilation, sightlines cleared for 300 yards in all directions. Inside, the cabin was Spartan, but not without comfort. A small bookshelf held worn classics, Shakespeare, Austen, Dickens, companions during long winter nights. A rocking chair faced the window with the best view of the approach to the property. The walls held no photographs or mementos. Ruby carried those memories where no one could take them from her. She washed up at the basin, then changed into a fresh shirt. Catching her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand, Ruby hardly recognized herself sometimes. At 26, the softness of youth had long since been scraped away, leaving behind high cheekbones and eyes the color of a thunderstorm, gray with flecks of blue that darkened when she was angry. Her hair chestnut with copper highlights, that gave her name a certain irony, was usually tied back in a practical braid that reached the middle of her back. Today she needed supplies. The monthly trip into town was a necessary evil, one that required her to don the disguise of normalcy. She changed into a modest blue dress, its design cleverly modified to accommodate her weapons. The right side had a hidden slit that allowed access to the peacemaker strapped to her thigh. The left gun would stay home today. In town, 1 was insurance, 2 would raise questions. As Ruby hitched Thunder to her small wagon, a dust cloud on the horizon caught her attention. Visitors were rare and rarely welcome. She squinted against the morning sun, recognizing the silhouette of Milton Parker's wagon. The traveling merchant made rounds through isolated homesteads every month or so, bringing supplies and gossip in equal measure. Ruby relaxed marginally, but kept her hand near her weapon as the wagon approached. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, even with familiar faces. "Morning, Miss Callahan," Parker called out as he pulled his team to a stop. He was a round man with a perpetually sunburned face and the practiced smile of someone who made his living telling people what they wanted to hear. "Beautiful day for business, wouldn't you say?" "Mr. Parker," Ruby acknowledged with a nod. "You're off your usual route." Parker's smile faltered slightly. Nothing escaped her notice, a fact that made him simultaneously respectful and uneasy in her presence. There were rumors about Ruby Callahan, whispers that followed her like shadows, nothing substantial enough to act on, but enough to make folks careful around her. "Sharp as ever," he chuckled nervously. "Taking a different path this month on account of trouble west of here. Thought I'd check if you needed anything rather than have you make the trip to town." Ruby's eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of trouble?" Parker shifted on his seat, suddenly finding the reins very interesting. Oh, probably nothing to worry about out here. Just some excitement at Yuma prison 3 days back. Breakout. 3 dangerous types. Word is they're headed for Mexico, but the marshals got posse searching everywhere just in case. Ruby absorbed this information, her expression unchanging. Any descriptions of these men? Leaders called Silas Blackwood, mean piece of work with a scar across his right cheek. Seconds, a brute they call Butcher Walton, got a reputation for violence. Third's younger, Travis McCoy, first-timer in for robbery, but threw in with the wrong crowd for escape. Parker leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially. They killed 2 guards getting out. Marshal Davis has authorized shoot on sight. Ruby nodded, filing away the information. Marshal Davis's name brought a bitter taste to her mouth. Clayton Davis had been her father's deputy once, before ambition corrupted whatever decency he might have possessed. Now he wore the badge of a territorial marshal, his crimes buried beneath commendations and political connections. I appreciate the warning, Mr. Parker. I'll keep my eyes open. Parker seemed relieved to have delivered his news. He was a gossip by nature and profession, but something about Ruby Callahan's calm intensity always left him feeling like he'd said too much while learning nothing in return. Got some nice fabrics in the back, he offered, eager to return to the comfort of commerce. New shipment of ammunition too, if you're running low. Ruby purchased ammunition, coffee, sugar, and a few other supplies she couldn't produce herself. Parker seemed surprised when she also selected a length of blue gingham fabric. "Making a new dress, Miss Callahan?" he asked, unable to picture this. Severe woman engaging in such a domestic pursuit. Ruby handed over her payment. "Curtains," she replied simply, though her mind was already calculating how many bandages the fabric would yield if necessary. 3 escaped convicts in the territory. Meant preparation, not decoration. As Parker's wagon disappeared in a cloud of dust, Ruby stood motionless in front of her cabin, considering this new information. Her plans for town could wait. Instead, she spent the afternoon checking her defenses, cleaning her weapons, and preparing for unwelcome visitors. The sun was beginning its descent when she finally settled in the rocking chair on her porch, a Winchester rifle across her lap and a cup of coffee cooling beside her. Thunder grazed nearby, his occasional snorts the only sound breaking the vast silence. Ruby watched the horizon with patient eyes. 3 desperate men running from the law would need horses, supplies, weapons. Her isolated ranch might prove an irresistible target, especially if they believed it was defended by nothing more than a lone woman. Let them come, she thought, her trigger finger tapping a gentle rhythm against the rifle's guard. The Phantom Rose hadn't claimed a victim in nearly 2 years. Perhaps it was time for the legend to bloom again. 3 days earlier, Yuma Territorial Prison had witnessed its first successful escape in 7 years. The prison sat like a fortress of despair on a bluff overlooking the Colorado River, its granite walls baking under the merciless sun. Inside those walls, Silas Blackwood had spent 4 years planning every detail of his escape, waiting for the perfect alignment of opportunity and desperation. The scar across his right cheek pulled tight as he smiled, remembering the expression on guard, Captain Wilson's face, when he realized the knife was between his ribs instead of safely in its sheath. It wasn't personal. Wilson had simply possessed the keys Silas needed. In Silas's world, survival trumped sentiment every time. How much further, Blackwood? Hank Butcher Walton growled, his massive frame struggling with the pace Silas had, set across the unforgiving desert landscape. Been walking 2 days straight with barely a rest. Silas didn't slow his stride. At 42, he was leaner than when he'd entered Yuma, prison rations having stripped away any excess. But where Butcher had softened, Silas had hardened, transforming himself into a weapon honed by patience and purpose. We stop when I say we stop, Silas replied, voice low and controlled. You want the marshal to catch up? Be my guest and take. A nice long nap right here. Behind them, Travis McCoy stumbled, catching himself before falling. At 23, he was the youngest of the three, serving his first sentence for a stagecoach robbery gone wrong. In prison, the choice had been simple: align with Blackwood for protection or become prey for men like Butcher. There's buzzards circling, Travis said, pointing skyward where three dark shapes wheeled lazily. Could be following the posse. Silas glanced at the younger man. Travis was different from most of the criminals who passed through Yuma's gates. Education in his speech, calculation in his eyes. A puzzle Silas hadn't quite figured out, which made the boy both useful and dangerous. Buzzards follow death, Silas replied. And death follows us. Question is whether we're the ones dealing it or receiving it. Butcher spat on the ground. Should have kept the guard's gun instead of tossing it in the river. And have every lawman within 50 miles recognizing a prison guard's service revolver? Silas shook his head. We need weapons they can't trace back to Yuma. They had escaped with little more than the clothes on their backs, a guard's knife, and a general heading toward the Mexican border. Silas had initially planned to go alone, but circumstances forced his hand. The prison had been conducting surprise cell inspections with increasing frequency. His window of opportunity was closing. He needed a distraction, and Butcher Walton was nothing if not distracting. Hank Walton had earned his nickname in the mining camps north of Tucson, where a dispute over cards had ended with 3 men butchered with their own prospecting tools. His size made him valuable for intimidation, and his appetite for violence made him predictable. Predictable people were easy to manipulate, and Silas was a master manipulator. Travis McCoy was a last-minute addition. The kid had overheard Silas and Butcher finalizing details and threatened to alert the guards. Instead of killing him, as Butcher had suggested, Silas recognized an opportunity. Travis was observant, quick-thinking, and most importantly, knew the territory between Yuma and the border better than either of them. We need to find shelter, Travis said, squinting at the sun hanging low in the western sky. Night gets cold in the desert this time of year. Desert ain't what concerns me, Butcher growled. It's Marshal Davis. Man's got a reputation for tracking escapees to hell and back. Silas's expression darkened at the mention of Clayton Davis. They had history, though neither his companions nor Davis himself knew the extent of it. 15 years ago, before the scar and the prison sentence, Silas Blackwood had been an enforcer for the cattle barons, pushing smaller ranchers out of the territory. Davis had been a deputy then, ambitious and corruptible. Their paths had crossed, over blood money and buried secrets. Davis is methodical, Silas acknowledged. He'll have men watching the obvious routes to Mexico, which is why we're heading east, not south. Travis looked up sharply. East? That ain't the plan. You said, plans change, Silas cut him off. We head east, find a place to restock, then cut south when they've focused their search elsewhere. Butcher frowned, his small eyes narrowing with suspicion. What place? Ain't nothing east of here. But more desert and scattered homesteads. Exactly, Silas smiled thinly. Homesteads mean supplies, horses, weapons, things we need if we're going to make it to Mexico alive. Travis's face showed his discomfort. You're talking about robbing innocent folks. I'm talking about surviving, Silas countered smoothly, unless you'd prefer to turn yourself in. I'm sure Marshal Davis would be gentle, considering you only killed 1 guard during our escape. The color drained from Travis's face. I didn't kill anyone. That was Butcher who— Shut your mouth, boy, Butcher snarled, taking a threatening step toward Travis. Silas stepped between them. Save it, we need each other for now. The truth was, Travis hadn't killed anyone. Butcher had handled most of the violence, eager for blood after years of restraint. But Silas knew the value of shared guilt. The more Travis believed himself implicated, the less likely he'd risk turning himself in or betraying them. They continued east as the sun began its descent, the terrain gradually changing from barren desert to scrubland, dotted with mesquite and creosote. Silas set a punishing pace, driven by a deeper purpose than mere escape. Freedom was only the beginning. Justice, or his twisted version of it, waited on the horizon. As darkness fell, they found shelter in a dry wash, the high banks providing some protection from the wind and prying eyes. Butcher collapsed immediately, his massive frame heaving with exhaustion. Travis gathered scrub for a small, smokeless fire while Silas stood watch, his predatory eyes scanning the darkening landscape. "We need water," Travis said quietly, voice cracking from thirst. They had been rationing their meager supply since the escape, each man down to his last few swallows. "There's a ranch about half a day's walk from here," Silas replied. "Small. Operation. Probably has a well." Travis looked up sharply. "How do you know what's out here?" Silas's hand unconsciously traced the scar on his cheek. "I know a lot of things, boy. That's why I'm still breathing, and most who've crossed me aren't." Later, with Butcher snoring and the fire reduced to embers, Travis moved closer to Silas, his voice barely audible. "I want no part in hurting innocent people. I'm not like Butcher." Silas studied the young man, noting the conviction in his eyes despite his fear. "Interesting. Then why were you in Yuma? Last I checked, they don't lock up choir boys." Travis's jaw tightened. Stagecoach robbery. But it wasn't supposed to go down like it did. No one was supposed to get hurt. But someone did, Silas guessed. "Driver took a bullet. Not from my gun, but I was there." Travis stared into the dying embers. 5 years they gave me. First offense." Silas nodded thoughtfully. The boy had a conscience, misplaced as it might be. Such things were weaknesses, but also potential levers to pull when needed. "Listen carefully," Silas said, his voice deadly serious. "Out here, there are two kinds of people, predators and prey. You want to survive, you better decide which one you are." Travis met his gaze unflinchingly. "Maybe there's a third kind. Those who just want to be left alone." Silas almost laughed. "Those are just prey that doesn't know it yet." He nodded toward the eastern horizon, like whoever's living at that ranch we're heading to. The first hints of dawn were breaking when they set out again, their throats parched, bodies aching from days of hard travel. Butcher had grown increasingly volatile, his massive hands clenching and unclenching as he muttered about what he'd do when they found the ranch Silas had mentioned. By mid-morning, they caught their first glimpse of it, a small cabin with a barn and corral nestled against a backdrop of rugged hills. Smoke rose from the chimney and a horse grazed in a nearby paddock. "Looks like just one person," Silas observed through narrowed eyes. "See anyone else, Travis?" The young man scanned the property carefully. "Just the one horse. Might be a single." "Homesteader." Butcher grinned, revealing teeth he'd filed to points during his years in prison. A self-administered intimidation tactic that disturbed even his fellow inmates. "Easy pickings. We do this my way," Silas warned, particularly eyeing Butcher. "Clean and quiet. We get supplies, horses if they have them, weapons, and move on. No unnecessary violence." "Since when do you care about violence?" Butcher challenged. "I don't," Silas replied coldly. "But I do care about survival. Bodies bring posses. Posses bring marshals. Think with your brain instead of your fists for once." As they moved closer, the figure at the ranch came into clearer view, a woman working alone by the corral. Silas felt a predatory smile spread across his face. This was even better than he'd hoped. A woman alone would be easy to intimidate, unlikely to resist 3 hardened men. "Remember," he cautioned as they prepared to approach, "we're just travelers in need of help. Play it civil until we're sure she's alone and see what we're dealing with." "She's alone, all right," Butcher said with a leer, "and I know exactly what I'm dealing with." Silas grabbed Butcher's shirt, pulling the larger man down to eye level. Touch her without my say-so, and I'll gut you myself. We need supplies and horses more than you need satisfaction. Understood?" Butcher jerked away, but nodded reluctantly. Travis said nothing, his face a mask of grim resignation. He'd made a devil's bargain with Silas for survival, and now the bill was coming due. As they approached the ranch, Silas adopted the weary posture of a traveler down on his luck, carefully, concealing the calculating predator beneath. From the corner of his eye, he saw the woman on the porch straighten, her hand moving subtly to her side. Something about her stance made him pause. There was none of the fear or surprise he'd expected, just watchful readiness. For a brief moment, Silas felt an unfamiliar sensation prickle along his spine. Caution. But he quickly dismissed it. After all, what threat could a lone woman possibly pose to three desperate men with nothing to lose? Ruby watched the three men approach with the stillness of a rattlesnake before it strikes. Their attempt at appearing non-threatening might have fooled others, but Ruby had survived by recognizing predators. These men moved like wolves. The lean one in front calculating each step, the massive one behind him barely containing his hunger, and the youngest trailing with reluctance. "Afternoon, ma'am," the leader called out, his voice carrying a practiced politeness that didn't reach his eyes. The scar across his cheek pulled tight as he smiled. "Name's Samuel Black. My brothers and I have been traveling cross-country, ran into some bad luck when our horses were stolen, wondering if we might trouble you for some water." Ruby's face revealed nothing as she catalogued details. Prison-pale skin despite their trail-worn appearance, the big one's pants, standard humor. Prison issue with the markings poorly removed, the young one's nervous glances toward the horizon rather than at her. "Water's at the well," she replied evenly, gesturing to the stone structure 30 paces to her right. "Help yourselves." The leader, Silas Blackwood, if Parker's information was correct, nodded appreciatively. "Mighty kind of you, miss." "Callahan," Ruby offered. "Ruby Callahan." "Traveling's been hard, Miss Callahan," Silas continued, taking a step closer than necessary. "Perhaps you might spare some food as well. We'd be happy to work for it, fix that sagging corral post, or chop some firewood." The massive man, likely Butcher Walton, leered at her in a way that made his interpretation of payment clear. Ruby's hand inched closer to the hidden slit in her dress. "Don't get many visitors out here," she remarked, deliberately keeping her tone conversational. "Especially not from the direction of humor." A flicker of tension crossed Silas's face, there and gone in an instant. "We came from Tucson, actually." "Strange route," Ruby observed. "Most folks from Tucson would approach from the North Trail. You came from the west." The youngest, Travis, shifted his weight nervously. Silas's practiced smile remained fixed, but his eyes hardened. "You seem to know a lot about trails for someone living alone out here," he said, voice dropping its friendly pretense. Thunder nickered nervously from the paddock, sensing the building tension. Dark clouds gathered on the western horizon, the promise of a rare but violent desert storm brewing. "I know enough," Ruby replied, "including that Yuma Prison had a breakout 3 days ago. 3 men. Descriptions matching you 3 pretty closely." Butcher's hand moved to his waistband where the guard's knife was concealed. "She knows too much, Silas. Let's just—" "Silas?" Ruby echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Thought your name was Samuel." The facade crumbled. Silas Blackwood straightened, dropping the weary traveler act as his hand drifted toward his hidden weapon. "Seems we can dispense with pleasantries, Miss Callahan. Yes, we're the men you've heard about. Now we need horses, supplies, and weapons. Provide them without trouble, and you'll live to tell the tale." Ruby's posture hadn't changed, but something in her eyes shifted, cold calculation replacing cautious observation. "I don't think so," she said simply. Butcher barked a harsh laugh. "You don't think so? Lady, you're outnumbered 3 to 1. "Wouldn't matter if it were 10 to 1, Ruby replied calmly. "You're not taking anything from this ranch." Silas studied her with newfound interest. Most people showed fear when confronted by escaped killers. This woman displayed only composed readiness. "What makes you so confident, Miss Callahan?" he asked carefully. Ruby's right hand remained suspiciously still by her side. "Last chance. There's water in the bucket. Drink your fill and move on." Butcher lost patience. "Enough talking." His hand closed around the knife's handle. "I'm gonna teach this bit." The sound came first, a sharp crack that echoed across the yard. Then the bucket beside Butcher exploded, water spraying as the bullet punched through metal exactly between his splayed fingers. None of them had seen Ruby draw. One moment her hand was empty, the next it held a Colt Peacemaker, hammer already cocked for a second shot. The movement had been too fast for the eye to follow. "Jesus Christ," Travis breathed, frozen in place. Silas's eyes widened fractionally, the closest thing to shock he'd shown in years. That draw had been inhumanly fast, and the shot perfectly placed as a warning rather than a kill. This was no ordinary homesteader with a hidden gun. "That's one," Ruby said evenly. "Next one won't miss flesh." Thunder rumbled ominously overhead as the storm clouds advanced, casting the scene in premature twilight. The first heavy raindrops began to fall, splattering in the dust between them. "Quite a shot," Silas observed carefully, mind racing to recalculate the situation. "Where'd a ranch woman learn to shoot like that?" Ruby's eyes never left them, her gun hand steady despite the intensifying rain. "My father taught me. He believed a woman alone needed certain skills." "Smart man," Silas replied. He raised his hand slowly, signaling Butcher to step back. "Seems we misjudged the situation." The rain was falling harder now, the distant rumble of thunder growing closer. Within minutes they'd all be soaked. "Storms moving in fast," Ruby observed dispassionately. "Flash floods in these parts will wash away any tracks. Good news for men running from the law." Silas caught her meaning. She was offering them a way to leave without further confrontation. The smart play would be to take the offer, but options were limited with a storm bearing down, no supplies, and a posse potentially close behind. "Could hole up in your barn until it passes," he suggested, nodding toward the structure. "We'll be gone by morning." "No!" Ruby's response was immediate. "You're not stepping foot in any building on my property." Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the standoff in harsh white light. The downpour was now a solid wall of water, reducing visibility and turning the yard to mud. Butcher, already soaked and increasingly agitated, growled, "We ain't standing out here all night, lady!" Another lightning strike, closer this time, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Thunder reared in the paddock, whinnying in distress. The storm was directly overhead now, one of those violent cloudbursts that transformed dry desert washes into raging rivers within minutes. "Your horse is spooked," Travis shouted over the storm. "He'll hurt himself in this." Ruby's eyes flicked, briefly toward Thunder, concern momentarily breaking through her impassive mask. The stallion was indeed panicking, charging the paddock fence with increasing desperation. Silas, ever the opportunist, recognized leverage when he saw it. "Let us help secure your horse in the barn," he called through the rain. "Then we can discuss arrangements that benefit us all." A flash flood was already forming along the natural drainage that cut beside the property. Within minutes, the yard between them and any path of escape would be impassable. Ruby calculated her options rapidly. "Your weapons," she demanded, voice cutting through the storm. "All of them, on the ground." Silas hesitated, then nodded. "Fair enough." He removed the knife concealed in his boot, placing it in the mud. With visible reluctance, Butcher did the same with the guard's knife. Travis, unarmed, simply raised his hands higher. "The one in your waistband, too," Ruby said to Silas, who smiled thinly before removing a crude shiv made from a spoon handle and dropping it beside the other weapons. Another panicked whinny from Thunder forced her decision. "Cabin, not the barn," she ordered, gesturing with her free hand while keeping the colt trained on them. "Move slowly. Any sudden moves, and I'll drop you where you stand." The men followed, her directions, slogging through the quickly forming mud toward the cabin's porch. Ruby backed up the steps, keeping the door and her aim steady as they approached. "Inside," she directed. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The small cabin suddenly felt claustrophobic with 3 additional bodies. Ruby positioned herself strategically, back to the wall, clear lines of sight to all 3 men and both potential exits. Outside, the storm raged with desert fury, rain pounding the roof like artillery fire. "Sit," she ordered, indicating the chairs at her small table. "Hands flat, palms down." Silas complied with calculated graciousness, as if he were a guest rather than a captive. Butcher's movements were stiff with barely contained violence. Travis simply looked relieved to be out of the storm. "Now what?" Silas asked, rainwater dripping from his hair onto the wooden table. "Mexicans stand off until the storm passes?" Ruby's gaze was unflinching. "Now you tell me why you really came here. This isn't just about supplies and horses." "What makes you say that?" Silas asked, cocking his head slightly. "Because there are 3 ranches between here and Yuma that would have been easier targets. You came here specifically." Travis looked sharply at Silas, clearly surprised by this information. Butcher's small eyes darted between them, sensing hidden currents. "Perhaps we just stumbled upon your hospitality by chance," Silas suggested smoothly. Ruby's laugh was short and humorless. "I don't believe in chance, Mr. Blackwood." Lightning illuminated the cabin in stark white flashes, casting dramatic shadows across their faces. The atmosphere inside was as charged as the storm outside. 4 predators circling, taking each other's measure, waiting for the first wrong move. Thunder's desperate whinnies punctuated the howling storm outside. Ruby's eyes flicked toward the window, concern for her horse briefly displacing her focus on the 3 convicts seated before her. "Your horse needs tending," Silas observed, his voice measured. "Unless you plan on shooting us all right now, you'll need to make a decision." Ruby's grip tightened imperceptibly on the peacemaker. "And what decision is that?" "Let one of us help you with the horse," Silas suggested. "The boy here has a way with animals." Travis straightened slightly. "I worked ranch horses before Yuma. I could help, while leaving you 2 unsupervised." Ruby's tone made it clear what she thought of that idea. Silas held up his hands, rainwater dripping from his sleeves. "We're not going anywhere in this storm. And you can't be in 2 places at once." Another crash came from outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of splintering wood. Thunder had broken through the paddock fence. Ruby made her calculation in an instant. From a concealed drawer beneath the table, she produced 2 pairs of iron manacles. "Put these on," she ordered, sliding them towards Silas and Butcher. "Hands in front where I can see them." Butcher glared at the restraints. "Like hell I will." "Do it," Silas cut in, already securing the manacles around his own wrists. "Use your head for once." With a growl, Butcher complied, the iron cuffs barely fitting around his massive wrists. "You," Ruby nodded to Travis, "you're with me. Any wrong move and I shoot them first, understand?" The young man nodded, his eyes flicking briefly toward Silas, who gave an almost imperceptible nod of approval. 5 paces ahead of me at all times," Ruby instructed as they moved toward the door. "Hands where I can see them." The storm hit them like a solid wall as they stepped onto the porch. Rain fell in blinding sheets, transforming the yard into a muddy quagmire. Thunder was running in panicked circles, trailing broken fence boards from his halter. "Circle wide to his left," Ruby called over the storm. "Don't approach head-on." Travis moved with surprising confidence, his approach to the panicked horse practiced and calm. "Easy, boy," he crooned, his voice barely audible through the downpour. Ruby maintained her position, dividing her attention between Travis, the horse, and the cabin door. The rain plastered her dress against her frame, revealing the holstered peacemaker strapped to her thigh. Inside the cabin, Silas tested his restraints with subtle movements. The manacles were solid, but the chain between them offered limited mobility. Beside him, Butcher strained more obviously against his bonds. "Quit it!" Silas hissed. "She'll see you." "She's occupied," Butcher growled. "We could rush her when she comes back in." Silas shook his head. "You'd be dead before you reached the door. Did you see that drawer?" His eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Something's not right about that woman. She's too prepared, too controlled." Butcher spat on the floor. "Just some ranch bitch with a lucky shot." "No," Silas contradicted quietly. "That wasn't luck." He glanced around the cabin, taking in details he hadn't noticed before. The reinforced door hinges, the strategic positioning of the furniture that eliminated blind spots, the small caches likely containing additional weapons. Outside, Travis had managed to calm Thunder enough to grasp his halter. The stallion still trembled, but the young man's quiet confidence seemed to steady him. "We need to get him to the barn," Ruby shouted over another crash of thunder. Together, they guided the nervous horse across the yard toward the barn, 50 yards of open ground that felt like miles in the driving rain. Inside the barn, the familiar smells immediately calmed Thunder further. Travis led him into his stall with practiced ease, moving with the natural rhythm of someone raised around horses. "You've done this before," Ruby observed, keeping the colt trained on him. Travis nodded, stroking Thunder's neck. "My pa had a small spread outside Tucson. Horses were my responsibility since I was old enough to reach the stirrups. Yet you ended up in Yuma." Travis's expression darkened. "Made some bad choices. Fell in with the wrong crowd." He glanced toward the barn door. "Not that it matters now." "It always matters," Ruby replied, studying him. "The choices we make define us." "How'd you end up out here alone?" Travis asked suddenly. Ruby's eyes narrowed. "That's not your concern. Just making conversation," he shrugged. "Most women don't choose to live alone in the middle of nowhere, especially not ones who can shoot like you." "Most women don't have my reasons," Ruby answered cryptically. Travis glanced at her gun, still held steadily despite the cold and rain. "Where'd you learn to draw that fast? That wasn't normal." Even Silas noticed. Ruby remained silent, but her eyes took on a distant quality. "My father taught me," she said finally. "He believed speed was life in this territory. Must have been quite a man, your father," Travis observed carefully. "He was," Ruby replied simply, the past tense hanging heavy in the air between them. In the cabin, Silas had continued his subtle exploration. On a high shelf above the fireplace sat a locked wooden box. Near it, a folded newspaper clipping had been partially concealed behind a jar. "She's hiding something," he muttered to Butcher. "This isn't just some random homestead." "Don't care what she's hiding," Butcher growled. "Once this storm passes, we take what we need and leave her for the vultures." Silas shot him a warning look. "Your lack of curiosity is why you'll always be muscle, never the brains." In the barn, Ruby decided they'd spent enough time away from the others. "Move," she ordered Travis, gesturing toward the door. "Same as before." The return journey to the cabin was even more treacherous, the yard now a flowing river of mud. As they approached, Ruby noticed something that sent ice through her veins. The cabin door was slightly ajar. "Stop," she commanded Travis, raising her gun. Travis froze, sensing the change in her demeanor. "What is it?" Ruby didn't answer, her focus entirely on the cabin door swinging gently in the wind. "Back to the barn," she ordered, not taking her eyes off the cabin. "Now!" Travis turned, confused but obedient. They had almost reached the barn when a gunshot echoed across the yard, the bullet kicking up mud inches from Ruby's feet. "That's far enough, Miss Callahan," Silas's voice called. From the cabin doorway, he stood framed in the entrance, manacles discarded, Ruby's second peacemaker held confidently in his hand. "I believe we need to renegotiate the terms of our stay." Behind her, Travis tensed. Ruby didn't flinch, didn't show surprise, merely adjusted. Her stance slightly to keep both men in her field of vision. "Interesting development," she said, her voice betraying nothing. "Tell me, Mr. Blackwood, how did you get those manacles off so quickly?" Silas smiled thinly, rain streaming down his face. "Let's just say it's not my first time wearing iron." "And the gun," she pressed, her own weapon steady despite the downpour. "Hidden. In plain sight," he replied, "under the floorboard by the table." He gestured with the peacemaker. "Now, let's all go inside and have a civilized conversation about our mutual futures." Ruby's mind calculated angles, distances, probabilities. Even at her speed, she couldn't guarantee taking Silas down before he got a shot off. Inside, Butcher had freed himself as well and sat grinning at the table, a knife twirling between his fingers. "Tables have turned, lady," he sneered. "Quiet," Silas ordered sharply. "Miss Callahan, please join us. Keep your gun if it makes you feel better, but understand the situation has changed." Ruby took the chair, offering the best vantage point, her back to the wall, eyes constantly moving between the three men. The standoff had evolved, but she showed no signs of fear or defeat. "You realize this changes nothing in the long run," she said calmly. "Storm will pass by morning. You'll still have the law on your trail." "True," Silas acknowledged, taking the seat opposite her, the stolen peacemaker resting easily in his hand. "But now we'll have horses, supplies, and weapons when we leave." His eyes narrowed shrewdly. "Unless, of course, you have something else to offer that might be of value." Ruby's expression remained impassive. "Such as?" "Information," Silas replied. "Like why a woman who shoots like a trained gunslinger is hiding out on an isolated ranch in the middle of nowhere." Lightning flashed, illuminating the cabin in harsh white light, the shadows playing across Ruby's face as she stared back at Silas. With cold calculation, "You're right, Mr. Blackwood," Ruby finally said, her voice steady. "I'm not what I seem. The question is, are you prepared for what that really means?" Silas leaned back in his chair, the stolen peacemaker resting casually in his hand. The cabin creaked around them as the storm intensified, wind howling through the smallest gaps in the walls. "That's quite a cryptic statement, Miss Callahan," Silas observed, his eyes never leaving Ruby's face. "Care to elaborate?" Ruby remained perfectly still, her own gun steady in her hand. The standoff had reached a precarious equilibrium, each armed, each dangerous, neither willing to make the first move. "Not particularly," she replied. "But I will say this. You picked the wrong ranch to raid." Butcher snorted derisively. "Big. And talk from someone outnumbered 3-1. Ruby's gaze flicked briefly to him, then back to Silas. "Numbers didn't save those two guards at Yuma, did they?" The mention of the prison guards hung in the air like gun smoke. Travis shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Ruby and his companions. "She doesn't know anything," Butcher growled. "She's bluffing." "Am I?" Ruby countered. "I know you killed Guard Captain Wilson with his own knife. I know you took the South Tower by surprise. And I know Marshal Davis has put out a territory-wide shoot-on-sight order for all three of you." Silas's expression remained neutral, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "News travels fast." "So do bullets," Ruby replied evenly. A flash of lightning illuminated the cabin, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder directly overhead. The storm had reached its peak, the rain now a solid wall of water battering the roof and walls. "This standoff isn't particularly productive," Silas observed. "Perhaps we should establish some ground rules for our unexpected cohabitation." "Such as?" Ruby asked, skepticism evident in her tone. "Such as agreeing that nobody sleeps tonight," Silas suggested. "You don't trust us. We don't trust you. Fair enough. But we all need rest eventually, and killing each other from exhaustion benefits no one. Ruby considered this, her expression giving nothing away. What else? We depart at first light, Silas continued. You provide us with basic supplies, food, canteens, ammunition if you can spare it, and we'll leave your property untouched. Generous of you, Ruby remarked dryly. Butcher shifted restlessly, clearly unhappy with the negotiations. His prison-filed teeth gleamed in the lamplight as he grimaced. This is a waste of time, Silas. We should just be quiet. Silas cut him off without looking away from Ruby. Adults are talking. Travis had positioned himself slightly apart from both sides, his divided loyalties evident in his posture. There's something on your mind, boy, Ruby observed, addressing Travis directly. Speak it. Travis hesitated, then straightened his shoulders. Those guards at Yuma, he said quietly. I didn't kill anyone. That was all Butcher. Shut your mouth, Butcher snarled, half rising from his chair. Sit down, Silas ordered sharply, then turned a calculating gaze on Travis. Having second thoughts about your companions, Travis. The young man met his eyes. I never wanted anyone to die. The plan was to escape, not commit murder. Ruby studied Travis with renewed interest. Perhaps there was more to the young convict than she'd initially thought. I need to check Thunder, she announced abruptly, breaking the silence. Silas raised an eyebrow. In this storm. Storm's the reason I need to check him, Ruby countered. Barns flood in weather like this. Silas considered for a moment, then nodded. Travis, go with her. Butcher leaned forward. You're letting her out again. She won't do anything foolish, Silas interrupted, his eyes fixed on Ruby, because she knows I'll be watching from the window with this very accurate peacemaker, and because she values that horse too much to risk its life with hasty actions. He smiled thinly. Isn't that right, Miss Callahan? Ruby's expression didn't change, but her silent acknowledgement was answer enough. She stood carefully, keeping her gun trained on Silas. Let's go, she said to Travis. They stepped out into the maelstrom once more, the short distance to the barn, now a treacherous journey through ankle-deep, flowing mud. The night was pitch black, except for occasional lightning flashes. In the dim, lamplight filtering through the cabin window, Silas could only make out their shadowy outlines as they fought their way toward the barn. Beside him, Butcher paced like a caged predator. You're making a mistake, trusting either of them, Butcher growled. Should have let me handle this from the start. Silas didn't look away from the window. Your handling usually ends with bodies, which tends to complicate matters. In the barn, Ruby checked Thunder quickly but thoroughly, relieved to find the structure sound and the horse calm. Water trickled under the door, but hadn't yet reached a concerning level. You're good with him, she acknowledged as Travis stroked the stallion's nose. Where did you learn that gentle touch? Travis shrugged. Like I said, grew up with horses, and ended up in Yuma anyway. Ruby's tone wasn't accusatory, merely observational. What really happened? Travis was silent for a long moment. Stagecoach robbery, he finally said. Wasn't my idea, but I went along. Driver wasn't supposed to get shot. But he did, Ruby supplied. Yeah. Travis's voice was barely audible above the storm. Butcher got trigger happy. Driver lived, but I got 5 years just the same. First. Offense. So how did you end up escaping with Blackwood and Butcher? Travis met her eyes directly. You ever been inside Yuma, Miss Callahan? Place like that, you ally with the strongest predator, or become prey yourself. Wasn't much of a choice. Ruby studied him, recognizing the hard truth in his words. She'd never been inside Yuma, but she'd survived her own kind of prison, the confinement of a notorious reputation, the isolation it forced upon her. I understand survival choices, Travis, she said quietly. But they have consequences. Outside, lightning split the sky directly overhead, followed by a thunderclap that shook the barn to its foundations. Thunder whinnied nervously, and Ruby moved automatically to soothe him. "Storm's getting worse," Travis observed. "We should head back." Ruby nodded, but as they turned to leave, she placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Travis, if you're telling the truth about not being a killer, you need to consider your options carefully. Marshal Davis shoots first and asks questions never." Back in the cabin, Silas had made a discovery. While watching the window, he'd noticed the newspaper clipping partially hidden on the shelf. With Butcher creating a distraction, he'd managed to quickly examine it without Ruby noticing. The yellowed paper contained a 5-year-old article about the hanging of Sheriff Thomas Callahan for corruption and murder. And there, in the grainy photograph of the crowd watching the execution, stood a younger Ruby Callahan, her face a mask of cold fury as she watched her father's death. More interesting still was the small notation in the margin, written in a careful hand. "Davis lied." When Ruby and Travis returned, soaked and mud-spattered, Silas greeted them with a newfound speculative interest in his eyes. "Storm's getting worse," Ruby announced unnecessarily, water pooling around her boots on the wooden floor. "Might not clear by morning after all." "Then it seems our time together has been extended," Silas replied smoothly. "How fortunate that we have so much to discuss, especially about the past." Ruby's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, catching something new in his tone. "The past is dead, Mr. Blackwood. Only fools dig up graves." "Perhaps," Silas agreed with a thin smile. "Or perhaps the dead simply wait for justice." The cabin fell silent except for the storm's fury. Outside, the night stretched dark and violent. Inside, the tension coiled tighter with each passing moment, a powder keg waiting for the inevitable spark. Dawn crept reluctantly through the cabin windows, the storm having finally exhausted itself sometime in the early morning hours. No one had slept. Ruby sat with her back against the wall, the peacemaker still in her hand, though fatigue had begun to tug at the edges of her awareness. Across the room, Silas maintained his own vigil, equally armed and alert. Butcher had eventually dozed off despite his best efforts, his massive frame slumped awkwardly in a chair. Travis had positioned himself near the window, gazing out at the mud-drenched landscape. "Quite a mess out there," Travis observed, breaking the long silence. "Wash is probably flooded," Ruby replied. "Trail to town will be impassable for at least a day." Silas stretched his neck, working out the stiffness from the night's stalemate. "Extending our time together," he remarked. "How unfortunate." Ruby's eyes narrowed slightly. Throughout the night, she'd noticed him studying her with increasing curiosity, as if trying to fit pieces of a puzzle together. "I should check Thunder," she said, rising carefully. "Of course," Silas agreed. "Travis, why don't you accompany Miss Callahan again?" As Ruby and Travis stepped outside, the cool morning air carried the earthy scent of wet desert. The yard had become a sea of mud, with new gullies carved by the flash floods. Inside the cabin, Silas moved immediately to the shelf where he'd spotted the newspaper clipping. Retrieving it, he examined it more carefully in the morning light. The article detailed the hanging of Sheriff Thomas Callahan, convicted of taking bribes from cattle rustlers and the murder of his deputy. "What's that?" Butcher asked, awakened. "By the movement. Information," Silas replied, his finger tracing the handwritten note in the margin. "Davis lied," he read aloud. "Now why would our Miss Callahan be keeping a notation like that about Marshal Davis?" In the barn, Ruby checked Thunder while Travis leaned against the stall door. "He seems fine," Travis observed. "You take good care of him." "He's all I've got," Ruby replied simply. Travis studied her for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" When Ruby didn't object, he continued. "That draw yesterday, I've never seen anything like it. Where does a woman learn to shoot like that?" Ruby's hand stilled momentarily on Thunder's flank. "I told you, my father taught me." "Your father must have been more than just some rancher," Travis pressed. Ruby turned to face him fully. "What's your interest in my past, Travis?" "Just trying to understand who I'm dealing with," he replied honestly. Ruby considered him for a long moment. "My father was Sheriff Thomas Callahan," she finally said. "He taught me everything I know about handling guns." Recognition flickered in Travis's eyes. "The sheriff who was hanged for corruption? I remember hearing about that. He was framed," Ruby stated flatly, "by his deputy, Clayton Davis, the same Marshal Davis who's now hunting you." "Jesus," Travis breathed. "And you've been carrying that all this time?" Ruby's expression hardened. "I carry more than memories, Travis. I carry the truth." When they entered the cabin, Silas was standing by the table, an expectant look on his face. Without preamble, he held up the newspaper clipping. "Found something interesting, Miss Callahan. Or should I call you the daughter of Sheriff Thomas Callahan, hanged for corruption and murder 5 years ago?" Ruby froze momentarily, then carefully closed the door behind her. "You've been going through my things," she observed coldly. "Information is survival," Silas replied unapologetically. "And this particular piece seems quite significant, especially with your handwritten note about Marshal Davis." "What's your interest in my father's death, Mr. Blackwood?" Silas smiled thinly. "Professional curiosity. It's not every day one finds oneself held at gunpoint by the daughter of a disgraced lawman." "My father wasn't disgraced," Ruby replied, her voice deadly quiet. "He was murdered by the system he served. Convicted on false testimony from his deputy, Clayton Davis, who wanted his job and was in the pocket of the cattle barons." Butcher suddenly laughed. "Wait, you saying you got a personal grudge against Marshal Davis? Hell, that makes you practically one of us." Ruby's gaze snapped to him with such cold intensity that even the hardened killer fell silent. "I am nothing like you," she stated flatly. "No," Silas agreed thoughtfully. "You're something far more interesting." He set the clipping on the table. "You're the Phantom Rose, aren't you?" The name hung in the air like gun smoke. Travis straightened in shock, looking between Silas and Ruby with newfound understanding. Even Butcher's perpetual sneer faltered as recognition dawned. Ruby remained, perfectly still, but her silence was confirmation enough. "I suspected something wasn't right about you from the start," Silas continued. "That draw was too fast, too professional. But I couldn't place why a simple rancher would have such skills until I saw this article." He tapped the clipping. "Sheriff's daughter, trained by her father, watches him hang for crimes he didn't commit. Disappears for a time. Then the stories start. A mysterious gunslinger who leaves a single dried rose on the bodies of corrupt men." Travis stared at Ruby with new eyes. "The Phantom Rose is a legend in the saloons. They say she's the fastest gun in the West." "Superstitious nonsense," Butcher scoffed, but his hand had unconsciously moved closer to his concealed knife. "Is it?" Silas challenged. "You saw that draw yesterday." Ruby finally spoke, her voice calm despite the tension. "What's your point, Mr. Blackwood?" Silas leaned forward. "My point, Miss Callahan, is that this changes things considerably. You're not just some rancher we can rob and leave behind. You're a wanted vigilante with a personal vendetta against the same marshal who's hunting us." "The enemy of my enemy," Travis murmured. "Precisely," Silas agreed. "Which leads me to a proposition that might benefit us both." Ruby's expression remained neutral. "I'm listening. Marshal Davis and his posse are likely already in the area, searching for us. When they find our tracks leading to your ranch, and they will, they'll come here." Silas spread his hands. "But what if, instead of finding 3 desperate escapees, threatening an innocent woman, they found the notorious Phantom Rose?" "You'd sell me out to save yourselves," Ruby concluded. "No," Silas corrected. "I'm suggesting a mutually beneficial arrangement. You have skills we need. We have information you might want. About Davis, about his operations, about the people. Who helped him frame your father? Ruby's eyes narrowed slightly. What information? Before Yuma, I worked for some of the same cattle barons who backed Davis's rise, Silas revealed. I know names, dates, details that might help your quest for justice. And in exchange, you help us reach the Mexican border. Ruby considered this proposal. Why should I trust anything you say? Silas shrugged. Trust has nothing to do with it. Self-interest guides us all. You want Davis to pay for what he did to your father. We want to reach Mexico alive. Before Silas could elaborate, Travis suddenly stiffened by the window. Riders coming, he announced tensely. 6 men, heavily armed, about a mile out. Ruby moved to the window, careful to stay out of sight. In the distance, she could make out the dust cloud raised by approaching horsemen. Even at this distance, the glint of badges was unmistakable. Looks like your decision just got accelerated, Miss Callahan, Silas observed calmly. Marshal Davis has found us. Ruby moved with decisive precision, her mind shifting from cautious standoff to tactical assessment in an instant. 6 riders, Davis and 5 deputies, she confirmed, staying clear of the window. They'll split up to surround the property. Silas watched her transformation with interest. The guarded rancher had vanished, replaced by a calculating strategist who betrayed no fear at the approaching lawmen, only focused preparation. Back door, he asked tersely, leads to a wash, flooded. Now after the storm. Ruby retrieved her second peacemaker from the floor where Silas had dropped it. With practiced movements, she checked its chamber and loading gate. No escape that way. So we fight, Butcher declared, a cruel smile spreading across his face. We think, Ruby corrected coldly. She turned to Silas. You said you have information. About Davis and my father. Prove it. Something specific, something I can verify. Silas recognized the test for what it was, her condition for any potential alliance. July 12th, 5 years ago, Davis met with Harold Bentley, the cattle baron, at the Copper Spur Saloon. Money changed hands, 1,000 in gold coins. 2 weeks later, evidence against your father mysteriously appeared. Ruby's eyes narrowed fractionally, the only indication that his words had hit their mark. How do you know this? I was there, Silas replied simply. Bentley's enforcer at the time. I provided security for the meeting. A long moment of silence stretched between them as Ruby calculated this new information against what she already knew. The distant sound of approaching hooves grew steadily louder. 3 minutes until they're within rifle range, Travis observed. Nervously from his position by the window, Ruby made her decision. There's a hidden cellar beneath the pantry floor. Weapons, cache, and supplies. Silas raised an eyebrow. How convenient. Not convenience. Preparation. Ruby moved to the pantry and pulled aside a worn rug, revealing a trapdoor. My father taught me to always have contingencies. Butcher watched suspiciously. Could be a trap. Use your head, Silas retorted. If she wanted us dead, she wouldn't need to trap us in a cellar to do it. Below, the cellar revealed Ruby's true preparations, a small arsenal of weapons, ammunition, preserved food, and water. Most tellingly, a carefully drawn map of the territory marked with locations, dates, and names was pinned to one wall. You've been planning something for years, Travis observed, seeing the meticulous detail of the map. Justice, Ruby replied, simply handing out extra ammunition. Davis is mine. That's non-negotiable. Silas recognized the cold resolve in her eyes, the kind that came from years of carrying a single purpose. Agreed, but we need a plan that gets all of us out of here alive. I have one, Ruby stated, pointing to a location on the map marked with yesterday's date. Davis doesn't know about the storm yet. His men will try to cross the wash to surround us. The same wash you said was flooded? Travis asked. Ruby nodded. 2, maybe 3 of them will get cut off from the main group when they realize they can't cross. That gives us better odds. Still leaves Davis and at least two others, Silas observed. Davis is cautious but arrogant, Ruby continued. He'll approach from the front, expecting to find frightened escapees or a victimized woman. He won't be expecting the Phantom Rose. Or three desperate men with nothing to lose, Silas added with a thin smile. Ruby fixed him with a hard stare. Let me be clear, Blackwood. This isn't a partnership. It's a temporary alliance of convenience. I help you get past Davis. You tell me everything you know about my father's frame-up. And then we part ways, Silas agreed smoothly. You to your vengeance, us to Mexico. Butcher spat on the cellar floor. Don't trust her, Silas. The moment Davis is down, she'll turn on us. She hasn't yet, Travis pointed out quietly. Because she needed us alive as bargaining chips, Butcher snarled. Now she's got bigger fish. Enough, Silas cut in sharply. We're out of time and options. He turned to Ruby. What's your plan? Ruby outlined it quickly, efficiently, like someone accustomed to planning operations. Travis and I take positions in the barn, sight lines to the front approach and the north side. You two stay in the cabin. When Davis calls out Blackwood, you answer like you're holding me hostage. That should draw him closer. And then? Silas prompted. Then we improvise, Ruby replied coolly, checking her weapons one final time. Improvisation gets people killed, Silas observed. Ruby's eyes met his with unflinching intensity. So does trusting the wrong people. Consider this a test of our temporary arrangement. They moved quickly after that, the sound of approaching riders now clear even inside the cellar. Ruby and Travis slipped out the back of the cabin toward the barn, keeping low and using the muddied yard to mask their footprints. Inside the barn, Ruby directed Travis to a hayloft position with clear views of the front approach. Can you shoot? She asked bluntly. Travis nodded. Grew up hunting. Not as fast as you, but I'm accurate. Aim for shoulders or legs, Ruby instructed, handing him a Winchester rifle. No killing unless absolutely necessary. Travis accepted the weapon with a questioning look. That's an unusual approach for the legendary Phantom Rose. Stories say you've killed more men than smallpox. Stories exaggerate, Ruby replied, checking her sightlines through a small window. I've killed 14 men. Each one deserved it. Each one connected to my father's death. And Davis will make 15, Travis concluded. Ruby didn't confirm or deny this, her focus now entirely on the approaching lawman. Through her vantage point, she could see Marshal Clayton Davis leading the group, a broad-shouldered man with a silver star pinned to his vest and cold eyes that had haunted her nightmares for 5 years. As predicted, Davis signaled for 2 of his deputies to circle around to the wash at the rear of the property. Another was dispatched toward the north side of the cabin, while Davis and the remaining 2 approached directly from the front, rifles ready. In the cabin, Silas and Butcher had taken positions out of sight of the windows, but with clear views of the front door. Silas's expression was calculating, measuring angles and opportunities. Beside him, Butcher's eyes held nothing but predatory anticipation. Remember, Silas murmured, we need her alive until we get what we need. Butcher grunted noncommittally, the knife in his hand suggesting his own plans might differ. Outside, Davis halted his horse about 50 yards from the cabin porch. Hello, the house, he called, his voice carrying authority, honed by years of command. This is Marshal Clayton Davis. We're looking for 3 escaped prisoners from Yuma Territorial Prison. Anyone inside is ordered to come out with their hands visible. Silas caught Ruby's eye through the window, received her slight nod, and responded as planned. Marshal, he called back, pitching his voice to sound desperate rather than controlled. Got a woman in here. You come any closer, she dies. Davis's posture shifted subtly, the scenario now familiar territory for a lawman of his experience. Who am I speaking with? Silas Blackwood. Me and my boys need safe passage or the woman gets it. In the barn, Ruby watched Davis lean over to confer with his deputies. Even at this distance, she could see the cold calculation in his familiar features, the same expression he'd worn while testifying against her father. "Mr. Blackwood," Davis called after a moment, "release the woman and surrender your weapons. I guarantee you and your men will receive fair treatment." Ruby almost laughed at the crude lie. Davis had never given anyone fair treatment in his life. His idea of justice came from the barrel of a gun or the end of a rope. "No deal, Marshal," Silas shouted back. "We need horses, supplies, and a 6-hour head start." From her position, Ruby could see the deputies who had been sent to circle the property now returning. Just as she had predicted, they'd found the wash impassable after the storm. Davis's flanking maneuver had failed, leaving all 5 lawmen on the front approach. Better odds, but still dangerous. Through her scope, Ruby studied Davis's face as he processed this setback. His expression remained controlled, but a muscle twitched in his jaw, a tell she remembered from childhood when her father's deputy was hiding something. "He's going to pretend to negotiate while positioning his men for a rush," she murmured to Travis. "Get ready." Sure enough, Davis made a show of dismounting, hands raised in a conciliatory gesture, while his deputies spread out in a subtle flanking formation. "Let's talk this through, Blackwood," Davis called. "Send the woman out as a show of good faith, and we can discuss terms." In the cabin, Silas glanced toward Ruby's position, receiving a slight headshake. "Not yet." "No chance, Marshal," Silas called back. "Woman stays with us until we're safely away." Davis took another step forward, apparently unarmed, though Ruby knew he likely had a hideout pistol somewhere on his person. "At least let me see that she's unharmed," he requested reasonably. Ruby felt her pulse quicken. This was the moment. Davis, approaching, his men slightly spread out, their attention focused on the cabin rather than the barn. She caught Travis's eye and nodded. Time to spring the trap. "Now," she whispered, raising her peacemaker and taking careful aim at the deputy. Furthest to the right. Ruby's finger tensed on the trigger, her breath slowing as she prepared to fire. Through the sight, she had perfect alignment on the deputy's shoulder, a shot that would disable without killing. But just as she began to squeeze, a voice from the past froze her in place. "Ruby Callahan!" Davis called out suddenly, his tone shifting from negotiation to knowing command. "I know you're here, girl. This ruse won't work." The unexpected address sent ice through Ruby's veins. Davis wasn't supposed to know she was Ruby Callahan. In 3 years their paths had never crossed, her identity carefully guarded, yet he had called her out directly by name. In the hayloft, Travis glanced at Ruby with alarm. "How does he—" She silenced him with a sharp gesture, mind racing to recalculate. The plan had already collapsed. Davis wasn't approaching the cabin as a marshal seeking escaped convicts. He was hunting specifically for her. "Miss Callahan," Davis continued, his voice carrying easily across the muddy yard. "I've been looking for you for quite some time. The Phantom Rose, they call you." He chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. "Though I suppose your father would be proud of how well you'd learned to shoot." In the cabin, Silas's eyes narrowed at this unexpected development. The lawman knew Ruby, knew her identity as the Phantom Rose. This wasn't a random encounter, it was a confrontation years in the making. Ruby stepped into view at the barn door, her peacemaker held ready but not aimed. "Hello, Clayton," she called, using his first name deliberately. "Been a while." Davis smiled, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. 5 years, give or take. You've been busy." He gestured to his deputies to hold their positions. 14 men, by my count, all with connections to your father's case, all with a dried rose left on their bodies. 15, Ruby corrected coldly. "You missed Jennings last month." Davis's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "So I did." The Tension between them crackled like static before a lightning strike. History, hatred, and unfinished business charged the air as they faced each other across the muddy yard. "How did you find me?" Ruby demanded, breaking the momentary silence. Davis smiled thinly. "You think I haven't been watching? Waiting for the Phantom Rose to make a mistake?" He shook his head. "When these three broke out of Yuma, I knew they'd head east. This territory only has so many isolated ranches where they might seek supplies. I've been checking each one." His smile widened. "But I admit finding you here, that's a bonus I hadn't anticipated." In the cabin, Silas processed this new information with calculating efficiency. The entire scenario had shifted. This wasn't about three escaped convicts anymore. This was about a personal vendetta between Ruby and Davis. It changed everything. "Butcher," he murmured. "Time to adapt." Ruby held Davis's gaze, refusing to show the turmoil beneath her composed exterior. "You framed my father," she stated flatly, "planted evidence, lied under oath, all for a promotion and Bentley's gold." "Your father was interfering with progress," Davis replied dismissively. "Tilting at windmills, trying to stop the territory's natural development. Bentley and the other ranchers were bringing civilization, jobs, future." "They were stealing land and killing anyone who resisted," Ruby corrected, her voice hard. "And you were their attack dog." Davis's expression darkened. "Your father was warned multiple times. He chose his path." "You chose it for him," Ruby countered, "the moment you planted that money in his saddlebags and claimed he was taking bribes." Travis watched this exchange from his hidden position, finally understanding the full weight of Ruby's vendetta. This wasn't simple revenge. It was justice for a deliberate, calculated murder disguised as legal execution. Davis sighed theatrically. "Ancient history, Ruby. What matters now is ending this." He gestured toward her. "The Phantom Rose has terrorized this territory for years. It's time she faced justice." "Justice?" Ruby's laugh was bitter. "You wouldn't recognize justice if it put a bullet between your eyes." "Speaking of bullets," Davis replied smoothly, "I notice we're having this conversation while you're holding me at gunpoint. Not exactly the behavior of an innocent woman." "Never claimed to be innocent," Ruby countered. "Just righteous." "Righteousness," Davis sneered. "Your father's favorite word. Right before they put the noose around his neck, he gave that same self-righteous speech about truth and justice prevailing." His expression turned cruel. "Didn't save him, did it?" Ruby's grip tightened on her peacemaker, the memory of her father's. Execution still sharp enough to draw blood, but she controlled the surge of emotion. Emotion led to mistakes, and mistakes led to death. "What's your play here, Clayton?" she asked coolly. "You're outnumbered. 3 convicts in the cabin, me. Out here, and only 5 of you." Davis's smile returned. "Am I really outnumbered, Ruby?" The question hung in the air for a moment before a cold realization dawned on her. She turned slightly, keeping Davis in her peripheral vision while glancing toward the cabin. Silas and Butcher had disappeared from their positions. "Your convict friends have been awfully quiet," Davis observed, "almost as if they've reconsidered their alliance." Ruby's mind raced, calculating possibilities. Had Silas betrayed her already? Was this entire scenario, the escapees arriving at her ranch, the discovery of her identity, a setup from the beginning? As if in answer to her unspoken question, Silas's voice called out from behind her. "Interesting reunion, Marshal Davis. Seems you two have quite a history." Ruby turned to find Silas standing at the corner of the barn, his stolen peacemaker held loosely at his side. His expression was unreadable, his position deliberately ambiguous, not clearly aligned with either Ruby or Davis. "Blackwood," Davis acknowledged with a nod. "I was wondering when you'd join the conversation." Ruby's eyes narrowed, shifting between the two men. "You know each other?" "Of course we do," Silas replied calmly. "As I told you, I worked for Bentley, the marshal, and I crossed paths numerous times. His gaze settled on Davis with something like amusement, though I imagine he's less than pleased to see me now, given our last encounter. Davis's expression hardened. That's ancient history, Blackwood. Is it? Silas raised an eyebrow. I seem to recall you made certain promises regarding my sentence if I kept quiet about certain activities. 5 years in Yuma, you said. His smile turned cold. It's been 4 years and 3 months, Marshal. Yet here I am, facing a hanging. If recaptured, Ruby watched this exchange with growing understanding. He betrayed you too, she concluded, looking at Silas. Let's just say the Marshal has a habit of changing terms after agreements have been made, Silas replied, his eyes never leaving Davis. Davis's face had become a mask of controlled fury. Enough of this. Blackwood, I'm offering you a deal. Help me take her in, and I'll ensure you and your men get safe passage to Mexico. Silas laughed softly. Another promise, Marshal? Your track record doesn't inspire confidence. The standoff had now transformed completely, a three-way tension with shifting alliances and uncertain outcomes. Ruby maintained her position, peacemaker, still ready, watching both men with equal wariness. Where's Butcher? She asked Silas quietly. Around, he replied vaguely. Insurance. Davis signaled subtly to his deputies, who began spreading out further, attempting to create a perimeter around the barn. Last chance, Blackwood, he called. Choose your side carefully. Silas seemed to consider this, then looked to Ruby. He's right about one thing, Miss Callahan. We should choose sides. He paused, then added with deliberate emphasis, Your father would expect nothing less. The strange emphasis caught Ruby's attention. Something in Silas's tone, in his specific reference to her father, triggered a memory. Something she couldn't quite place, but that resonated deep within her consciousness. My father? She questioned, watching Silas closely. Silas held her gaze meaningfully. Sheriff Thomas Callahan was a man of principle, never compromised, even when it would have saved his life. He glanced briefly toward Davis. Even when offered a deal by those who framed him, something clicked in Ruby's mind. Those weren't just words of general knowledge. They were specific details about her father's final days, details that few people knew. How do you know that? She demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. Silas's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Because I was there, Ruby, in the cell next to him, the night before they hanged him. The revelation hit Ruby like a physical blow. Her father's last night alive, a mystery she had never been able to penetrate, questions that had haunted her for 5 years. He spoke of you, Silas continued quietly. Said his daughter would carry on his work. Said you'd find the truth someday. His eyes hardened as he looked toward Davis. Said the Marshal was just a puppet, with someone much more powerful pulling the strings. Davis's face contorted with rage. Shoot them! He shouted to his deputies. Shoot them both, now! Gunfire erupted across the yard as Davis's deputies responded to his command. Ruby moved with blinding speed, shoving Silas behind the barn wall as bullets splintered wood where they had been standing seconds before. Travis, Ruby called, dropping to one knee and returning fire with precision that forced the deputies to scramble for cover. Here, Travis responded from the hayloft, the Winchester's sharp report providing covering fire as Ruby and Silas pressed themselves against the barns. Exterior wall. Some negotiator you are, Silas remarked dryly, checking his peacemaker's chamber. Ruby ignored the comment, her mind focused entirely on the tactical situation. Davis won't risk coming close. He'll try to pin us down, wait us out, or burn us out, Silas added grimly. Man has a reputation for impatience. From their position, they could see Davis shouting orders, directing his men to encircle the barn, while maintaining cover behind water troughs, fence posts, and the natural contours of the muddy yard. You really knew my father? Ruby asked, timing her words between exchanges of gunfire. Last night of his life, Silas confirmed, firing a shot that sent a deputy diving for cover. I was in the next cell, awaiting transfer to Yuma. He knew they were going to hang him at dawn. What did he say? Ruby's voice remained steady, but the question carried the weight of 5 years of wondering. Silas met her eyes briefly. That he was innocent, that Davis had planted evidence on orders from someone powerful, that his daughter would find the truth someday. Another volley of bullets interrupted them, wood splinters flying as the deputies intensified their fire. Inside the barn, they could hear thunder whinnying in distress. We need to move, Ruby decided. Barn's too exposed and they'll target thunder to draw us out. The air was suddenly split by a much louder report. A rifle shot from some distance away. One of Davis's deputies cried out, clutching his arm as he fell behind a water trough. That wasn't Travis, Silas observed, his brow furrowing. Ruby risked a glance around the corner and saw Butcher positioned on the cabin roof, a rifle in his massive hands. He fired again, the shot driving another deputy to ground. Your insurance has surprisingly good aim, Ruby remarked. Man's full of surprises, Silas replied, though usually they involve more blood. A sharp whistle from Travis drew their attention to the hayloft window. He pointed urgently toward the rear of the property. Following his gesture, Ruby saw 2 riders approaching from the direction of the flooded wash, reinforcements for Davis. Marshall called in backup, she observed grimly. That wash must have receded faster than I expected. Silas checked his ammunition. 5 shots left. You? 4 in this one, 6 in the other, Ruby replied, plus whatever Travis has in the Winchester. Not enough for a protracted firefight, Silas concluded. Inside the barn, Thunder's distress was growing more pronounced. A stray bullet had punched through the wall near his stall, and the stallion's panicked movements threatened to injure him. In the confined space, I need to move him, Ruby decided. Back of the barn connects to a root cellar. Tunnel leads to the house. Silas raised an eyebrow. You didn't mention that escape route earlier. Didn't trust you earlier, Ruby replied, bluntly. She called up to Travis. Cover us! We're moving to the house. Travis nodded, positioning himself better at the hayloft window and firing a series of shots that forced Davis and his men to keep their heads down. Ruby and Silas slipped inside the barn, moving quickly to Thunder's stall. The horse was wild-eyed with fear, but Ruby's voice seemed to cut through his panic. Easy, boy. Easy, she soothed, her tone a remarkable contrast to the cold precision she showed in combat. We're getting out of here. With practiced movements, she led the stallion toward the back of the barn, where a trapdoor was concealed beneath hay bales. Silas helped clear the way, keeping his weapon ready as they worked. Phantom Rose! Davis's voice called from outside. You're surrounded. Throw out your weapons and surrender. Ruby didn't bother responding, focused instead on opening the trapdoor and guiding Thunder toward the narrow stairs leading down. Horse won't like that, Silas observed. He's done it before, Ruby replied, stroking Thunder's neck reassuringly, before beginning the delicate process of leading him downward. Remarkably, the stallion followed with only minimal hesitation, as if understanding the danger they faced. Once below, Ruby turned to Silas. Get Travis. I'll start Thunder through the tunnel. Silas moved to the hayloft ladder. Travis, fall back. We're moving out. The young man fired a final covering shot before scrambling toward the ladder. As he descended, a bullet shattered the hayloft window, showering him with glass and splinters. They're getting bolder, Travis observed, brushing debris from his shoulders as he joined them at the trap door. Because they're getting reinforcements, Ruby replied, nodding toward the sound of new voices outside. The 3 of them descended into the root cellar, closing the trapdoor behind them. The space was cool and dark, smelling of earth and stored vegetables. A narrow tunnel, barely tall enough for Thunder to pass through in a crouched position, led away from the cellar. Your father teach you to build secret tunnels too? Silas asked, eyeing the surprisingly well-constructed passage. Previous owner was a Confederate deserter, Ruby explained, guiding Thunder into the tunnel. Spent the war hiding from both sides. Had a talent for underground construction. They moved quickly but carefully through the dirt passage. Thunder, following Ruby with remarkable trust, despite the confined space. Behind them, they could hear muffled shouting as Davis's men discovered the barn was empty. Won't take them long to find the trap door, Travis warned. Doesn't matter, Ruby replied. Tunnel has a collapse trigger halfway through. Once we're past it, I can bring down enough dirt to block pursuit. Silas glanced at her with newfound respect. You really did prepare for everything. Survival depends on preparation, Ruby stated flatly, my father's first lesson. The tunnel gradually sloped upward until they reached a crude wooden door. Beyond it lay the cellar beneath Ruby's cabin. As Travis guided Thunder through, Ruby paused at a notched timber supporting the tunnel roof. Go, she instructed Silas. I'll trigger the collapse. Silas hesitated. How do I know you won't seal yourself in and leave us to Davis? Ruby met his eyes in the dim light. You don't. Trust has nothing to do with it, remember? After a moment's consideration, Silas nodded and squeezed past her toward the cellar. Once he was clear, Ruby pulled the notched timber, causing a section of the tunnel roof to crumble with a muffled rumble. Earth and rocks filled the passage behind them, effectively sealing that route. In the cabin cellar, they paused to regroup. The ceiling above them creaked with movement. Someone already in the cabin. Butcher, Silas whispered. He must have fallen back here. Ruby nodded, then turned to Thunder, securing him in the largest part of the cellar. Stay, she murmured. To the stallion, her hand lingering briefly on his muzzle before she moved toward the steps leading up. At the top of the stairs, a small viewing port allowed them to confirm Butcher's presence before emerging. The massive convict was positioned by a window, rifle ready, keeping watch on the yard beyond. Took you long enough, Butcher growled as they joined him. Marshall's got at least 8 men out there now, more coming. Options? Silas asked, moving. To another window to assess the situation. Ruby checked her peacemakers methodically. Cabin's more defensible than the barn, but they'll eventually rush it or set it on fire. Or both, Travis added grimly. Through the window, they could see Davis organizing his expanded force, positioning riflemen to cover all sides of the cabin. The marshal himself remained mounted on his horse, directing operations from a distance too far for an accurate pistol shot. He's keeping back, Ruby observed, frustration evident in her voice. Coward always did prefer to let others take the risks. Man survived this long by being cautious, Silas remarked. He won't expose himself unnecessarily. A deputy approached, the cabin with a makeshift white flag, a handkerchief tied to a stick. Marshal Davis offers terms, the man called. Surrender the Phantom Rose and the rest go free. Butcher spat on the floor. Like hell. Ruby's expression remained impassive, but her eyes had taken on a calculating look. He's lying, of course. None of us would leave alive. Of course, Silas agreed. But his offer confirms something important. What's that? Travis asked. Davis wants Ruby more than he wants us, Silas explained, his mind clearly working through various scenarios. That gives us leverage. What kind of leverage? Ruby asked skeptically. Silas turned to her, his expression serious. The kind that might get some of us out of here alive, with the right play. A bullet shattered the window, sending glass fragments spraying across the cabin floor. Outside, Davis's patience was clearly waning. What's your play, Blackwood? Ruby demanded, keeping low as more shots peppered the cabin walls. Silas moved to the rear window, calculating angles and distances. Davis wants you badly enough that he might believe a betrayal among thieves. You'd turn me over. Ruby's hand instinctively moved toward her peacemaker. I'd make him think we were turning you over, Silas corrected. Create a distraction, divide his forces, give us an opening. Butcher fired through a splintered board, grinning savagely as a cry from outside confirmed his hit. Don't need tricks, just need more ammunition, which we don't have, Travis pointed out, checking the Winchester's dwindling supply. Another volley of shots hit the cabin, one bullet passing clean through the wall, inches from Butcher's head. The big man ducked reflexively, his expression darkening. They're getting closer, he growled, testing our response. Ruby moved to the front window, risking a quick glance outside. Davis had positioned his men in a tightening semicircle around the cabin. Two deputies were advancing with a large wooden object, a battering ram for the door. We're out of time. In for discussion, she announced, turning back to Silas. What exactly are you proposing? Silas outlined his plan quickly. It was dangerous, dependent on precise timing and Davis's predictable nature, but it was the best option they had against overwhelming numbers. It might work, Ruby acknowledged reluctantly, if everyone plays their part perfectly. And if it doesn't? Travis asked, his young face tense with concern. Then we die fighting instead of waiting to be burned out, Silas replied matter-of-factly. Thunderous crash against the door punctuated his words. The battering ram had made first contact, the solid wood shuddering but holding for now. We need to create chaos, Ruby decided, moving to a concealed cache beneath a floorboard. From it, she withdrew a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. And, fast, unwrapping the package revealed sticks of dynamite, mining charges, compact but powerful. Travis's eyes widened at the sight. Where did you get those? Previous owner, Ruby replied, carefully extracting one stick. Confederate deserter, remember? Man believed in being prepared for anything. Another crash rocked the door, the wood beginning to splinter around the hinges. Outside, Davis's voice called out orders, directing his men to prepare for a breach. Butcher, Silas commanded, south window, get their attention. The big man grinned savagely, moving to position and firing rapidly through the opening. The deputies with the battering ram ducked for cover, momentarily abandoning their assault on the door. Meanwhile, Ruby prepared the dynamite with practiced motions, attaching a short fuse. This goes out the back, she explained, nodding toward a window facing away from the main confrontation. When it blows, they'll split their forces to investigate. That's when Travis and I make our move, Silas continued, checking his peacemaker one final time. Ruby struck a match, lit the fuse, and with precise aim threw the dynamite through the rear window. It landed exactly where intended, far enough from the cabin to avoid damage, but positioned to create maximum confusion. Down, she commanded, as all four pressed themselves to the floor. The explosion was deafening, sending a plume of dirt and debris skyward behind the cabin. As predicted, shouts of alarm spread through Davis's men, several breaking formation to investigate the unexpected threat. Now! Silas hissed, and Travis scrambled to the door, throwing it open just enough to shout, Marshal! Blackwood says he'll turn over the woman, says he wants to make a deal. From his position, Davis hesitated visibly, suspicious but clearly, tempted by the offer. Send her out first, he called back. No, Travis yelled. Blackwood says you come to the door, just you. Says he doesn't trust your men not to shoot him. During this exchange, Ruby had slipped through a concealed trapdoor in the pantry floor, accessing the cellar where Thunder waited. Silas positioned himself beside the front door, peacemaker ready. Marshal's moving, Butcher reported from his window, voice low. Coming forward, but keeping his hand near his gun. As expected, Silas murmured. Ruby? In position, her voice. Confirmed from below, barely audible through the floorboards. Davis approached cautiously, stopping 10 paces from the cabin. Blackwood, he called. Show yourself if you want to deal. Terms first, Marshal, Silas shouted back. Safe passage to Mexico for me and my men. The woman's all yours. Davis's laugh was cold. You're hardly in a position to negotiate, Blackwood. Have what you want, Silas countered. The Phantom Rose. The woman who's been hunting your associates for years. Seems like that's worth something. The mention of his associates visibly unsettled Davis. It confirmed what Ruby had suspected. The Marshal's corruption extended far beyond her father's case. Fine, Davis agreed after a moment's consideration. You and your men can go. But I want the woman first. Look at your feet, Marshal, Silas called. Confused, Davis glanced down to see a thin stream of water trickling toward him from beneath the cabin. As the Marshal processed this strange development, a thunderous crash erupted from beneath the structure. The sideboards of the cabin splintered outward as thunder burst through, Ruby low on his back, both peacemakers drawn. She had circled beneath. The building, emerging exactly where Davis stood exposed. The Marshal's reflexes were quick, his hand darting toward his gun, but Ruby was faster, impossibly faster. 2 shots rang out in such rapid succession they sounded almost as one. Davis's gun hand jerked backward, his weapon flying unfired from nerveless fingers. The second bullet took him high in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Now! Silas shouted, bursting through the cabin door with Travis behind him. Butcher provided covering fire from the window as planned, forcing the deputies to seek cover. Rather than aid their fallen leader, Ruby wheeled Thunder directly over Davis's prone form, the stallion's hooves deliberately missing the Marshal by inches as she leaned down to press a peacemaker against his chest. "Hello, Clayton," she said, her voice deadly calm, despite the chaos erupting around them. "Remember me now?" Davis's face contorted with pain and fury. "You won't get away with this," he gasped. "You're surrounded." "Not for long," Ruby replied, her eyes cold as winter steel. "You're coming with us. Insurance." With remarkable strength, she hauled the wounded Marshal across Thunder's withers. Blood from his shoulder wound stained the horse's grey coat as Davis struggled weakly against her iron grip. "Blackwood!" Ruby shouted. "Move!" Silas, Travis, and Butcher broke from the cabin in a coordinated rush, firing suppressing shots that kept the deputies pinned down. They converged on Ruby's position as she wheeled Thunder toward a narrow path leading into the foothills behind her property. "This wasn't the plan," Silas snapped as they ran, bullets kicking up dirt at their heels. "Plans change," Ruby replied tersely. "Davis comes with us. I'm not letting him slip away again." Behind them, the deputies were regrouping, but confusion and concern for their leader's safety slowed their pursuit. The small party reached the tree line, the terrain offering natural cover as they pushed deeper into the wilderness. Twilight descended on the foothills as the small group pushed deeper into the rugged terrain. Thunder carried both Ruby and the wounded Davis, whose muttered curses had gradually faded into pained silence. Behind them, distant shouts confirmed the posse's pursuit, though the rocky ground left minimal tracks to follow. "Need to stop," Silas announced, his breathing labored from the hard climb. "Regroup, decide our next move." Ruby nodded tersely, guiding Thunder toward a sheltered overhang formed by weather-worn boulders. The natural formation offered concealment and protection from the wind that had begun to rise as night approached. "Butcher, Travis, keep watch," Silas directed as they reached the temporary sanctuary. 30 minutes rest, then we move again." Ruby dismounted with fluid grace, then unceremoniously dragged Davis from Thunder's back. The Marshal groaned as he hit the ground, his shoulder wound still seeping blood, despite the crude bandage Ruby had applied during their flight. "He needs better treatment," Travis observed, glancing at the fallen lawman before moving to his assigned. "Lookout position. He needs to answer for his crimes," Ruby replied coldly. "Treatment comes after truth." Silas watched this exchange with calculating eyes, his expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. "A wounded hostage slows us down," he remarked, "especially one who'll be hunted by every lawman in the territory." "He's not a hostage," Ruby countered. "He's leverage, and my best chance at finally proving my father's innocence." Davis laughed weakly from his position on the ground. the sound holding no humor. "Still chasing ghosts, Ruby," he managed. "Your father's dead. Nothing will change that." Ruby knelt beside him, her face inches from his. "But your life can still change, Clayton. Prison, hanging, depends how cooperative you decide to be." Davis's eyes held nothing but contempt. "You won't make it 10 miles with me. My men will hunt you to the ends of the earth." "Brave words for a man bleeding out in the dirt," Ruby observed dispassionately. She moved to Thunder, retrieving a canteen and some basic medical supplies from her saddlebags. Though her actions were rough, she tended Davis's wound with practical efficiency, cleaning and rebandaging it with strips torn from her underskirt. "Why bother?" Davis asked, watching her work. "Dead men tell no tales," Ruby replied simply, "and you have a lot to tell." Silas approached, crouching near them to keep his voice low. "We need to discuss our arrangement, Miss Callahan. This wasn't part of the deal." Ruby continued her ministrations without looking up. "Deals changed. You said you have information about my father's frame-up. Davis has more. Together, you might actually be useful." "And after we're useful?" Silas pressed. "What then?" Now Ruby did look up, her eyes meeting his directly. "That depends on how truthful you both decide to be." A few yards away, Butcher watched this exchange with growing impatience, his massive hands clenching and unclenching unconsciously. Travis noticed the big man's restlessness and shifted slightly, putting himself in a better position to observe both lookout points and the increasing tension within their group. "You promised us Mexico," Butcher growled, loud enough for all to hear. "And you'll get there," Ruby replied evenly, "after I get what I need." Silas studied her for a long moment, then nodded almost imperceptibly. "Fair enough, but Davis's posse complicates things. We need a new route, one they won't expect." "I know these mountains," Ruby said, finishing with Davis's bandage and rising to her feet. "There's a pass to the east, rarely used. It adds a day to the journey, but avoids the main trails." "And puts us closer to the territorial border," Silas observed. "Smart," Davis laughed again, the sound strained but mocking. "You trust these killers, Ruby? Men who'd slit your throat for $1? His eyes shifted to Silas. "Or did Blackwood not tell you about his specialty? The jobs he did for Bentley that went beyond simple intimidation?" Ruby's expression remained impassive. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Clayton. 3 escaped convicts and a corrupt marshal. Trust doesn't enter into it." 10 minutes, Silas announced, checking the darkening sky. "Then we move." As the others prepared to continue their journey, Travis approached Ruby, his voice pitched low for her ears alone. "Butcher's getting agitated," he warned. "Man's like a powder keg in the best of times. Now—" He glanced toward the massive convict, who was staring at Davis with undisguised malice. Ruby nodded slightly, acknowledging the concern. "Keep an eye on him. We need Davis alive." "It's not just Davis I'm worried about," Travis admitted. "The way he looks at you when you're not watching." A sudden commotion interrupted their hushed conversation. Butcher had grabbed Davis by his injured shoulder, hauling the marshal to his feet with brutal disregard for his wound. "Enough talk," the massive convict snarled, his filed teeth gleaming in the last light of day. "This lawman's slowing us down. I say we end him now." "Put him down," Ruby commanded, her hand dropping to her holstered peacemaker. "He's worth nothing to us dead." Butcher's small eyes narrowed dangerously. "You don't give orders here, woman." Silas stepped forward, his expression tense. "Let him go, Butcher. The lady's right. He's our insurance." For a moment it seemed Butcher might defy them. Both. Then with deliberate slowness, he released Davis, shoving the marshal roughly back to the ground. "This arrangement ain't working," Butcher growled, addressing Silas directly. "First, she takes a hostage without consulting us. Now she's giving orders like she's in charge. Calm yourself, Silas replied evenly. Remember the bigger picture. Butcher spat on the ground near Davis's prone form. Mexico's the bigger picture, not her vendetta. The tension hung in the air, thick and dangerous, until Travis interrupted from his lookout position. "Riders!" he hissed urgently. "Coming up!" In from the south. Immediately, all attention shifted to the new threat. Ruby moved silently to Thunder, calming the stallion with a gentle touch to prevent any betraying nickering. "How many?" Silas asked, joining Travis at the rocky outcrop. 4, maybe 5, Travis reported, moving slow, searching, not the main posse, probably a splinter group. "They're cutting off our route to the pass," Ruby observed grimly. Davis's pained laugh drew their attention. "Told you," he managed through gritted teeth. "My men are good trackers, best in the territory." Ruby's expression hardened. "Then we need a diversion." Her eyes met Silas's, and something unspoken passed between them, a shared understanding born of survival instinct rather than trust. "I'll draw them off," Silas decided. "Travis, you're with me. We'll circle back and rejoin at Cottonwood Creek by dawn." Ruby nodded, accepting the plan. "And Butcher?" "Stays with you," Silas replied firmly. "Make sure our friend the Marshal behaves himself." Butcher's expression darkened further at this assignment, but he nodded grudgingly. The arrangement made tactical sense, dividing their strengths while maintaining control over their prisoner. Silas and Travis prepared to leave. Ruby pulled Silas aside, her voice pitched low. "Why are you helping me?" "Really?" Silas studied her for a moment. "Let's just say your father made an impression in the short time I knew him. Man like that deserves justice." He paused, then added with quiet intensity, "And Davis deserves whatever's coming to him." Before Ruby could press further, Silas moved away, signaling Travis to follow. The two men slipped into the gathering darkness, taking a route that would make their tracks obvious enough for the searching riders to follow. Left alone with Butcher and Davis, Ruby felt the delicate balance of power shift dangerously. Thunder sensed her tension, moving closer as if offering protection. "Best get moving," she stated calmly, helping Davis to his feet with more care than Butcher had shown. "We need distance before those riders realize they're following a false trail." Butcher watched her with undisguised malevolence. "Silas might buy your act, lady, but I don't. First chance I get, I'm settling things my way." "There's no act." "Butcher," Ruby replied coldly, "just survival, something you should understand." She helped Davis onto Thunder, then mounted behind him, keeping one arm securely around the Marshal's waist, while her other hand remained near her holstered peacemaker. "Let's go," she ordered. "And remember, we need him alive." They moved deeper into the foothills, following a rocky trail that would leave minimal signs of their passage. The night closed around them, the only sounds their careful footsteps and Davis's occasional pained breathing. After an hour of difficult travel, they reached a small stream bed tucked between steep slopes, a defensible position with access to water. Ruby called a halt, easing Davis down from Thunder's back. "We rest here," she announced. 2 hours, no more." Butcher grunted acknowledgement, claiming a position with his back against a boulder. His eyes never left Ruby as she secured Davis too, a stunted pine with a length of rope from her saddlebags. "Not taking chances, are you?" Davis observed, grimacing as she tightened the bindings. "Never did," Ruby replied. "That's how I've stayed alive this long." Once Davis was secured, Ruby moved to Thunder, quietly checking the stallion for any injuries from their difficult journey. The horse nuzzled her affectionately, seeming to understand the need for silence. "You and that horse," Davis remarked, watching her, "always were unnaturally attached to animals, even as a child." Ruby stiffened slightly at this personal observation. "You don't get to reminisce, Clayton, not after what you did." "What I did," Davis laughed softly. I offered your father a choice, Ruby. Same choice I offer every man who gets in Bentley's way. Step aside or face consequences. He chose poorly. Ruby's hand tightened on Thunder's mane, but she kept her voice controlled. He chose rightly. He chose justice over corruption, truth over money. And look where it got him, Davis countered, 6 feet under while Bentley's empire only grew stronger. Your father died for nothing. Ruby turned slowly to face him, her expression terrible in its calm intensity. No, Clayton, he died for everything that matters, and you'll answer for it. I promise you that. Throughout this exchange, Butcher had remained ominously silent, his gaze shifting between Ruby and Davis with calculating malice. Now he rose, moving closer under the pretense of checking their surroundings. Woman like you, he said suddenly, addressing Ruby, all fire and righteousness. Reminds me of someone I knew once. Ruby regarded him warily, recognizing the dangerous shift in his tone. Is that so? Butcher nodded, a cruel smile spreading across his face. My wife, before I killed her. The statement hung in the air like a blade. Davis tensed visibly, sensing the escalating threat even in his weakened state. Ruby's expression remained neutral, but her hand drifted casually toward her holstered peacemaker. That's unfortunate, she replied evenly. For her. For you, Butcher corrected, his massive frame tensing like a predator preparing to strike. Because I'm thinking Silas has been too patient, too cautious. We don't need this lawman, and we sure as hell don't need you once you've led us through that pass. Ruby's draw was lightning fast, the peacemaker clearing leather before Butcher could lunge forward. But to her shock, the hammer fell on an empty chamber. The gun misfired, an impossibility for a weapon she maintained with religious care. Butcher's savage grin widened as he saw her momentary confusion. Checked your gun while you were tending the horse, he revealed, producing a handful of bullets from his pocket. Always was good with sleight of hand. Ruby's second peacemaker cleared its holster, but Butcher was already upon her, his massive hand closing around her wrist with crushing force. The gun discharged harmlessly into the ground as they struggled. With a brutal twist, Butcher wrenched the weapon from her grip, then slammed his fist into her midsection. Ruby doubled over, fighting for breath as stars exploded behind her eyes. Been waiting for this since the cabin, Butcher growled, grabbing her by the throat and lifting her until her feet barely touched the ground. Little Miss Gunslinger, not so fast now, are you? Through the haze of pain and oxygen deprivation, Ruby saw Davis watching impassively from his position tied to the tree. No help would come from that quarter. With desperate strength, she drove, her knee upward, connecting solidly with Butcher's groin. The big man grunted in pain, but didn't release his grip. Instead, he slammed her against the rocky ground, pinning her with his weight. Fiery, he growled appreciatively. Like I said, just like my wife. Ruby's vision began to darken around the edges as Butcher's grip tightened on her throat. In a last desperate move, she reached for the knife hidden in her boot. Her fingers closed around the handle just as consciousness began to slip away. With the last of her strength, she drove the blade into Butcher's side. The massive convict howled in pain and rage, releasing her throat to grab at the embedded knife. Ruby rolled away, gasping for air, her hand finding a fist-sized rock. As Butcher lunged for her again, she swung with all her might, connecting solidly with his temple. The big man staggered, momentarily dazed, blood flowing from both his head wound and the knife still protruding from his side. But like a wounded bear, the injury only seemed to fuel his rage. With a roar, he charged again. Ruby, still fighting for breath, couldn't move fast enough to evade him completely. His massive fist caught her shoulder, sending her spinning to the ground. Pain exploded through her arm, but survival instinct kept her rolling, putting precious distance between them. I'm going to enjoy this, Butcher snarled, pulling the knife from his side and advancing on her again. Gonna take my time with you? Ruby backed away, searching desperately for a weapon. Her peacemakers lay somewhere in the darkness, lost during the struggle. Thunder was pouring nervously nearby, disturbed by the violence but unable to help. Then, unexpectedly, Davis spoke from his position against the tree. "Walton," he called, his voice carrying surprising authority despite his wounded state. "Take care of the woman later. I'm still your primary problem." Butcher hesitated, glancing toward the marshal. "You're tied up, lawman. Not going anywhere." "But I know things," Davis pressed. "Things about the real power in this territory. Things that make me valuable alive to certain people." This caught Butcher's attention. "What things?" Ruby used the momentary distraction to scan the ground. Around her, finally spotting the gleam of metal, one of her peacemakers, half buried in the dirt just a few feet away. "Untie me," Davis continued, maintaining Butcher's focus, "and I'll tell you who really runs this territory, who could make you rich beyond imagining for delivering me safely to them." Butcher's greed visibly warred with his bloodlust. "Why should I believe you?" "Because I'm a survivor," Davis replied smoothly, "and right now, my survival depends on appealing to your self-interest." As they spoke, Ruby inched closer to the dropped weapon, moving with agonizing slowness to avoid drawing Butcher's attention. "What about her?" Butcher demanded, gesturing toward Ruby with the bloodied knife. "Kill her if you want," Davis offered callously. "She means nothing to me, except as a means to clear my name. The crime of escaping prisoners, murdering the daughter of a disgraced sheriff, will hardly raise eyebrows." Ruby's fingers finally closed around the grip of her peacemaker. She checked the chamber with practiced movements, confirming Butcher had indeed emptied it when he tampered with the weapon. "So we have a deal," Davis pressed. Watching Butcher's internal debate play across his face, the massive convict nodded slowly, apparently deciding that potential wealth outweighed immediate gratification. "Deal, but she dies first." As Butcher turned back toward Ruby, his expression promising death, a shot rang out from the darkness. Butcher staggered, looking down in confusion at the spreading red stain on his chest. Travis stepped from the shadows, the Winchester rifle still raised. "Heard the commotion," he explained quietly. "Doubled back to check." Butcher took another stumbling step forward, his massive frame refusing to acknowledge the fatal wound. Then his legs gave way, and he collapsed heavily to the ground, the knife falling from nerveless fingers. "Silas?" Ruby asked hoarsely, her throat bruised from Butcher's assault. "Creating a false trail as planned," Travis replied, moving cautiously toward Butcher's body to confirm he was dead. "I got worried when you two didn't show at the meeting point." Ruby nodded gratefully, retrieving her second peacemaker and reloading both weapons from her hidden ammunition reserves. Davis watched this exchange with calculating eyes. "Interesting," he observed. "Trust among thieves appears more reliable than I expected." Ruby turned to him, her expression cold, despite the relief of survival. "I told you, Clayton. I know exactly who I'm dealing with." She glanced at Travis, adding quietly, "All of them." Dawn painted the eastern sky with pale gold as Ruby, Travis, and their captive reached Cottonwood Creek. The shallow stream gurgled peacefully over smooth stones, a stark contrast to the tension that hung in the air. Silas was already there, waiting in the shadow of a massive cottonwood tree, his expression shifting from wariness to recognition as they approached. "Butcher?" he asked simply, noting the massive man's absence. "Dead," Ruby replied, dismounting with controlled movements. That couldn't quite hide her injuries from Butcher's attack. He made his choice. Silas nodded once, accepting this information without visible reaction. "Started thinking you weren't coming." "Had to take a longer route," Travis explained, helping the wounded Davis down from Thunder's back. "Posses expanded their search. They're combing these hills systematically." Ruby secured Davis against a tree, checking his bandages with efficient movements. The marshal's wound had begun to fester despite her care. his skin hot with fever. He wouldn't survive much longer without proper medical attention. "We need to move soon," she stated, straightening. "Davis's men will find Butcher's body by midday. That'll concentrate their search in this area." Silas studied their captive's deteriorating condition. "He won't make it to Mexico like this." "Mexico was your destination, not mine," Ruby reminded him. Moving away from the others, she beckoned Silas to follow. Once they were out of earshot, she lowered her voice. "I need to know everything you know about my father's case. No more delays, no more half-truths." Silas considered her for a long moment. "Your father was investigating cattle rustling," he finally said. "But not ordinary thieves. This was organized, professional. Hundreds of head disappearing with no tracks, no witnesses." "Bentley?" Ruby supplied. Silas nodded. "Bentley was involved, yes. But he wasn't the mastermind. He was working for someone with connections all the way to the territorial governor's office." Ruby's eyes narrowed. "Who?" "Judge William Morrison." The name hit Ruby like a physical blow. Morrison had presided over her father's trial, had sentenced him to hang while looking him directly in the eye. The respected judge whose reputation for integrity was nearly legendary throughout the territory. "That's not possible," she whispered. "Morrison was a family friend. He dined at our table. He used that position to monitor your father's investigation." Silas finished for her. "The judge's legitimate businesses provided perfect cover for laundering money from the rustling operation." Ruby's mind raced, reassessing 5 years of assumptions and plans. If Silas was telling the truth, her vengeance had been severely misdirected. Davis was merely a corrupt pawn, not the architect of her father's destruction. "How do you know this?" she demanded. "I was Bentley's enforcer," Silas reminded her. "I was in the room when they planned the frame-up. Morrison ordered it, Bentley financed it, Davis executed it." Ruby turned toward Davis, seeing him with new eyes. The marshal met her gaze unflinchingly despite his pain, his expression suggesting he knew exactly what information Silas had just revealed. "Judge Morrison built his empire on stolen cattle and dead men," Silas continued. "Your father was getting too close to the truth, so Morrison ordered him eliminated. But a respected sheriff couldn't just disappear. It had to look legitimate." "So they framed him," Ruby concluded, her voice flat. "Made him appear corrupt, then executed him legally." Silas nodded. "Morrison presiding over the trial was the final insult. Man had no shame." Ruby absorbed this information silently, her face a mask of controlled fury. Then with deliberate movements, she drew her matched peacemakers, checking each chamber methodically before replacing them in their holsters. "Change of plans," she announced, returning to where Travis guarded their prisoner. "I'm taking Davis to Copper Springs." "The town?" Travis asked incredulously. "That's suicide. Every lawman in the territory will be looking for us there." "Exactly," Ruby replied, her eyes cold with purpose. "It's where Morrison holds court every third Wednesday of the month, which happens to be tomorrow." Understanding dawned on Silas's face. "You're going after the judge." "I'm going after the truth," Ruby corrected. "Davis is going to confess to everything. The frame-up, the rustling operation, Morrison's involvement, all of it." Davis laughed weakly, his fever giving the sound a delirious quality. "And why would I do that?" Ruby knelt beside him, her voice soft but implacable. "Because if you don't, I'll deliver you to Bentley instead of the law." She smiled without warmth. "I imagine he'd be quite interested to learn how cooperative you've been with us." The color drained from Davis's face. Bentley's methods of dealing with betrayal were legendarily brutal. "You're insane," he whispered. "Morrison controls everything in Copper Springs. The sheriff, the courts, half the businesses. You won't get within 100 yards of the courthouse." "That's where you're wrong," Ruby replied. "Because I have Something Morrison wants even more than he wants me dead. What's that? Travis asked. Ruby's eyes never left Davis as she answered. Evidence. My father kept journals, detailed records of his investigation, names, dates, connecting Morrison to everything. I found them after his death, kept them hidden all these years. Davis stared at her in shock. That's impossible. We searched everywhere. Not everywhere, Ruby countered. They're the reason I bought that specific ranch. Previous owner had hidden compartments built throughout the property, perfect for keeping secrets. She turned to Silas and Travis. This is where we part ways. You do head for Mexico as planned. I'm taking Davis to Copper Springs. Alone? Travis asked, concern evident in his voice. Against Morrison's entire operation? Ruby's expression softened slightly. This isn't your fight. It is now, Silas interjected unexpectedly. Butcher's death will be blamed on all of us. Mexico isn't. Far enough if Morrison has the connections you say he does. He checked his peacemaker with methodical precision. Besides, I owe your father a debt. Man could have implicated me in his testimony, bargained for leniency. He didn't? Travis nodded agreement. I'm with you too. Rather face whatever's coming head-on than spend my life running. For a moment Ruby seemed about to argue further, then simply nodded her acceptance. We'll need supplies, ammunition, fresh. Horses for you too. I know a place, Silas offered. Old line shack about 3 miles east. Used by Bentley's men during cattle drives. Should have basic provisions, maybe weapons. Ruby considered this, then nodded decisively. We resupply, then ride for Copper Springs. But understand what you're getting into. Morrison won't just roll. Over because we have Davis and some journals. This ends with blood. Whose blood? Travis asked quietly. Ruby's eyes hardened as she checked her father's pocket watch. A treasured keepsake and painful reminder. Whoever stands between me and justice. As they prepared to move out, Ruby took a moment alone with Thunder, stroking the stallion's neck while murmuring softly to him. The horse had been her only constant companion through years of isolation and planning. Now, as she prepared for what might be her final confrontation, his steady presence grounded her. Remember what I taught you. Her father's voice seemed to whisper from memory. Speed gets attention, but accuracy keeps you breathing. And never, ever lose control. Ruby closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. When she opened them again, her expression had transformed. The isolated rancher, the cautious survivor, both personas fell away, revealing the deadly precision of the phantom rose in full bloom. It was time to finish what had begun 5 years ago on a hangman's platform. The line shack stood in a small clearing, weathered boards silvered by years of sun and wind. From their vantage point among the scrub pines, Ruby studied the structure with professional caution, noting the fresh horse tracks leading to and from the crude corral behind it. Someone's been here recently, she observed quietly. Silas nodded. Bentley's men use it regularly during the season. Might still be occupied. They watched for 10 careful minutes, seeing no movement, no smoke from the chimney. Finally, Ruby made her decision. Travis circle around back. Silas take the front. I'll cover you from here with the Winchester. She glanced at Davis, secured to Thunder's saddle. He stays with me. Travis and Silas moved with practiced stealth, approaching the shack from different angles. Ruby sighted down the rifle barrel, ready to provide covering fire if needed. Beside her, Davis watched the operation with feverish intensity. Morrison will kill you all, he murmured, his voice hoarse with infection. Man has eyes everywhere. Ruby didn't respond, her focus entirely on her companions as they reached the shack. Silas signaled that the structure appeared empty, then cautiously pushed open the door. After a tense moment, he emerged, waving them forward. Clear, he called. And stocked. Someone's been using it as a waypoint. Ruby led Thunder down the slope, keeping the rifle ready despite Silas's all clear. Years of vigilance had taught her that survival depended on perpetual caution. Inside, the shack revealed a smuggler's treasure trove, crates of ammunition, preserved. Food, even medical supplies, lined the rough-hewn walls. Maps pinned to boards showed detailed routes through the territory, many avoiding official trails and checkpoints. "Bentley's expanded his operation," Silas observed, examining the maps. "These are smuggling routes from Mexico, guns going south, probably opium coming north." Ruby located the medical supplies, selecting items to treat Davis's worsening wound. Despite her hatred for the man, she needed him alive and coherent enough to testify. "Hold him," she instructed Travis, as she prepared to clean the infected shoulder. Davis grimaced as they removed his bandages, revealing angry red flesh and telltale streaks of blood poisoning extending down his arm. "Won't do any good," he muttered, through clenched teeth. "It's gone too far." Ruby ignored his fatalism, working efficiently to clean and redress the wound. She applied a poultice of herbs from the supplies, then administered laudanum for the pain, just enough to dull it without rendering him unconscious. "He needs a real doctor," Travis observed quietly. "He'll get one after he testifies," Ruby replied, securing the fresh bandage. Meanwhile, Silas had inventoried their newfound resources. "Ammunition for all our weapons, food for a week, even fresh horses in the corral," he reported. "Whoever's running this post is well supplied, and will likely return soon," Ruby added, gathering what they would need for the final leg of their journey. "We take only what's necessary and move out within the hour." As they prepared, a folded newspaper caught Ruby's eye. It was tucked beneath one of the crates, its edges protruding just enough to be visible. She retrieved it, finding a week-old edition of the Copper Springs Sentinel. The headline froze her blood. "Judge Morrison succumbs to heart failure." "No," she whispered, scanning the article with increasing desperation. According to the paper, William Morrison had died peacefully in his sleep 5 days earlier. The town was in mourning, with his funeral scheduled for, Ruby checked the date, tomorrow. "Problem?" Silas asked, noting her sudden pallor. Wordlessly, she handed him the newspaper. He read it quickly, his expression darkening. "Changes things," he observed grimly. "Changes everything," Ruby corrected, her voice hollow. "Morrison was the linchpin. Without his confession or testimony—" She trailed off, the implications clear. Davis laughed weakly from his position on the bunk. "Told you Morrison would win," he taunted. "Man always covered his tracks. Even death couldn't find him before he was ready." Ruby approached him slowly, the newspaper clutched in her hand. "You knew," she accused. "You knew he was dead when you mentioned his court date." Davis smiled through his pain. "Course I knew. Whole territory knows. Been laughing at your ignorance this entire time." With unexpected violence, Ruby grabbed him by the shirt front, pulling him upright despite his injured shoulder. "Then why keep up the pretense? Why let us take you toward Copper Springs if you knew our plan was already in ruins?" "Because every mile you traveled with me was another mile away from the truth," Davis replied, grimacing through the pain. "Another day wasted while evidence disappeared." Ruby released him abruptly, turning away to control the rage threatening to consume her. 5 years of planning, of single-minded purpose, all potentially undone by Morrison's timely death. "What evidence is he talking about?" Travis asked, looking between them in confusion. Ruby took a steadying breath before answering. "My father's journals weren't the only evidence. There were bank records showing payments from Morrison to Davis, letters between them discussing the frame-up." "Hidden at your ranch," Silas concluded. Ruby nodded grimly. "In the root cellar, protected from fire, from casual searches, but not from a determined effort by people who know what they're looking for. And now that I'm missing, Morrison's men will tear your property apart, looking for anything that connects him to your father's case," Davis added, clearly relishing her realization. "Judge may be dead, But his organization lives on. Too many powerful men implicated to let the truth surface now. Ruby's mind raced, calculating distances and times. They were at least 2 days' hard ride from her ranch. Any evidence there was, likely already compromised or destroyed. "We need to change course," Silas stated, what they were all thinking. "Cut our losses. Head for Mexico while we still can." Ruby stood motionless, the newspaper still clutched in her hand. Her entire adult life had been defined by the quest for justice for her father. To abandon it now, when she'd come so close— "No," she said finally, her voice taking on a steel edge that made both men look up sharply. "Morrison may be dead, but his organization continues. Davis is still alive, still capable of testimony. Testimony that won't matter without evidence to corroborate it," Silas pointed out pragmatically. "There is evidence," Ruby countered, "just not at my ranch." She turned to Davis, whose smile had faded at her renewed determination. "My father didn't trust just one hiding place. He was too smart for that." Moving to her saddlebags, Ruby withdrew a small leather pouch. From it, she removed a tarnished silver key with an ornate head. "Safe deposit box," she explained. "First National Bank of Copper Springs. Contains duplicates of everything, the journals, the bank records, even signed affidavits from witnesses who've since disappeared." Davis's face drained of what little color remained. "You're bluffing," he accused, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Am I?" Ruby challenged. "You knew my father, Clayton, knew how methodical he was, how he always prepared for every contingency." She tucked the key back into its pouch. "Why do you think I've stayed free all these years? It wasn't just skill with a gun. It was the insurance this key represents." Silas studied her with new respect. "Morrison's men will be watching the bank, especially with the funeral tomorrow bringing attention to anything connected to the judge. Which is exactly why it's the perfect time to access that box," Ruby countered. "Everyone will be at the funeral. The bank will be minimally staffed." Travis looked between them, clearly torn between admiration for Ruby's determination and concern for their survival. "Even if we get the evidence, then what? Morrison's dead. Who do we take it to?" "Territorial Marshal James Coleman," Ruby replied, without hesitation. "He operates out of Tucson, independent of local influence. My father trusted him, sent him a letter before his arrest, but it arrived too late." The plan took shape rapidly after that. They would ride for Copper Springs immediately, through the night if necessary, to reach the town by morning. While the town focused on Morrison's funeral procession, Ruby would access the bank vault and retrieve the evidence. Then they would take Davis and the documentation to Tucson, to Marshal Coleman. As they prepared the fresh horses, loading them with supplies and securing Davis to a sturdy mount, Ruby felt a strange sense of clarity descend. For 5 years, she had lived in the shadow of her father's death, defined by her quest for vengeance. Now, with Morrison beyond her reach, justice had become her only remaining goal. "You look different," Travis observed as they prepared to depart. Ruby glanced at him questioningly. "Calmer," he explained. "More purposeful." She nodded slightly, understanding what he meant. The burning rage that had fueled her for so long had transformed into something colder, more focused. Morrison's death had changed the nature of her inquest, shifting it from personal vengeance to the higher purpose her father had always served, justice under the law. "My father used to say that revenge satisfies only the soul, while justice serves the greater good," she told him, adjusting. "Thunder's saddle one final time. I think I finally understand what he meant." As they rode out, leaving the line shack behind, Ruby felt the weight of the key against her chest, where she'd secured it on a chain beneath her shirt. Not just a key to a bank vault, but to the truth her father had died protecting. The point of no return lay behind them now. Ahead waited Copper Springs, the funeral of a corrupt judge, and their last chance to set right a 5-year-old injustice. Copper Springs emerged from the morning mist like a mirage, its buildings etched against the pale dawn sky. Ruby, Silas, and Travis observed from a ridge overlooking the town, noting the black bunting that draped the courthouse and Main Street. Businesses, in honor of Morrison's funeral. Town's already stirring, Silas remarked, watching early risers move purposefully through the streets. Funeral set for 10 o'clock, according to that paper. Ruby nodded, her eyes fixed on the first. National Bank, a solid brick structure standing proudly at the corner of Main Street and Crawford Avenue. It would open at 9, giving her a narrow window to access the safe deposit box before the funeral drew everyone away. "I'll go in alone," she stated firmly. "Less conspicuous that way." "And us?" Travis asked, gesturing to himself and Silas. "Watch. Davis, secure our exit route." She handed him the Winchester rifle. "If something goes wrong, don't wait for me. Get the marshal to Tucson." Davis, still feverish but more lucid after Ruby's treatment, laughed weakly from his saddle. "You'll never make it out of that bank alive. Every lawman in the territory knows your face." Ruby turned to him with a cold smile. "They know the Phantom Rose, not Ruby Callahan." From her saddlebag she pulled out a simple dress, folded carefully, to prevent wrinkles. Remarkable how invisible a woman becomes when she looks like what men expect to see. Their plan took shape with military precision. Ruby would change her appearance, enter town as a widow, coming to settle her husband's affairs, and access the safe deposit box. Meanwhile, Silas and Travis would secure Davis in an abandoned mining shack on the outskirts of town, ready for a quick departure once Ruby returned with the evidence. As they prepared to separate, Travis approached Ruby with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Be careful in there," he said quietly. "This town belonged to Morrison, still does in many ways." Ruby nodded, acknowledging both his concern and its validity. "I survived 5 years as the Phantom Rose. I can survive one morning as a banker's widow." The transformation was remarkable. Within 20 minutes, the deadly gunslinger had disappeared. In her place stood a demure widow in black, her hair pinned severely beneath a small hat with a partial veil. The matched peacemakers were hidden beneath the dress's full skirts, accessible through carefully designed slits. "Impressive," Silas observed. "You've done this before." "Many times," Ruby confirmed, adjusting her hat to better shadow her features. "How else do you think I tracked Morrison's men all these years?" With a final check of the silver key hanging. From a chain around her neck, Ruby mounted Thunder and headed toward town. At the outskirts, she would stable the distinctive stallion and proceed on foot, just another bereaved woman in a town already focused on death. The streets of Copper Springs were busier than usual, visitors from surrounding communities arriving for the judge's funeral. Ruby moved through them like a ghost, her posture deliberately subdued, her pace unhurried despite the urgency pulsing through her veins. The bank stood as she remembered it, imposing granite facade with polished brass fixtures, the very image of frontier prosperity and stability. As she approached, Ruby noted the reduced security, just one guard rather than the usual 2, the second presumably reassigned to the funeral proceedings. Inside, the marble-floored lobby echoed with her measured footsteps. 3 tellers served, a modest line of customers, while the bank manager's door stood open, its occupant visible as he reviewed paperwork at his desk. Ruby joined the shortest line, keeping her gaze downcast as she waited her turn. "May I help you, ma'am?" the teller asked when she reached the counter. "I need to access my late husband's safe deposit box," Ruby replied, her voice soft and laced, with an appropriate hint of grief. She presented the key, along with identification papers she'd prepared years ago for this very purpose. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield. My husband made arrangements before his passing. The teller examined her documentation with practiced efficiency. Of course, Mrs. Whitfield. Let me summon Mr. Patterson to assist you. As the bank manager approached, Ruby tensed inwardly while maintaining her outward composure. Patterson had known her father, had even attended his trial. Would he recognize Sheriff Callahan's daughter beneath the widow's weeds? Mrs. Whitfield. Patterson greeted her formally, showing no sign of recognition. Please follow me to the vault. Relief washed through her as she followed him past the teller windows and through a heavy door leading to the bank's rear section. The vault stood open during business hours, its massive circular door an impressive display of security and engineering. Box number? Patterson inquired, consulting his ledger. 217, Ruby replied, the number etched in her memory since her father had whispered it to her during their final meeting before his arrest. Patterson led her to a wall of numbered metal boxes, located 217, and inserted his master key. Ruby added her own key to the second lock, and together they turned them, opening the box. I'll give you privacy, Patterson offered, stepping back. Pull the cord when you're finished. Alone with the box, Ruby moved with swift precision. Inside lay exactly what she had hoped for. A leather portfolio containing her father's meticulous documentation of Morrison's crimes. Bank records showing suspicious transfers. Sworn statements from witnesses, detailed timelines connecting Morrison to cattle rustling, land theft, and ultimately the framing of Sheriff Thomas Callahan. Ruby quickly transferred the most crucial documents to a hidden pocket in her dress. As she worked, the sound of raised voices reached her from the lobby, unusual in the typically hushed environment of the bank. Closing the box and pulling the cord to summon Patterson, Ruby strained to hear the commotion. The bank manager returned. Promptly, his professional demeanor slightly ruffled. Apologies for the disturbance, Mrs. Whitfield. There seems to be some excitement regarding the funeral procession. Ruby thanked him, maintaining her persona as he escorted her back to the lobby. There, the source of the commotion became immediately clear. Standing at the main entrance was Deputy Sheriff Frank Wilson, one of Davis's most trusted men. With him were two other deputies, their eyes scanning the bank's customers with obvious purpose. "Nobody leaves until we've checked everyone," Wilson was announcing. "Marshal's orders. We have reason to believe a dangerous fugitive may be in town." Ruby's heart raced, but her outward appearance remained calm as she moved toward a side exit. She had nearly reached it when Wilson's voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "You there, ma'am in the black dress." Ruby froze, then slowly turned, keeping her face partially obscured by her veil. "Yes, officer?" Wilson approached, his hand resting casually on his holstered revolver. "Where are you headed in such a hurry?" "Ma'am?" "To my boarding house," Ruby replied softly. "I find this commotion distressing. My nerves aren't what they used to be since my husband's passing." The deputy studied her, suspicion warring with ingrained courtesy toward a widow. "Your name, ma'am?" "Eleanor Whitfield," Ruby supplied, gesturing toward the bank manager. "Mr. Patterson can vouch for me. I've just concluded my business here." Patterson nodded in confirmation, but Wilson seemed unsatisfied. "Would you mind lifting your veil, Mrs. Whitfield? Just a formality." The moment of decision had arrived. Ruby could comply, risking recognition, or refuse, confirming his suspicions. As her hand rose toward her veil, the bank's front doors burst open, and a breathless messenger rushed in. "Deputy Wilson, they found Marshal Davis. He's alive." Wilson's attention snapped to the messenger. "Where?" "Old mining shack east of town." "But, sir, there's more. They say he's with Silas Blackwood and another escaped convict." The deputy's face hardened as he issued rapid orders, completely forgetting Ruby in the excitement. "Jenkins, stay here. The rest of you with me." As Wilson and his men rushed out, Ruby seized the opportunity, slipping through the side exit into an alley. The Documents secure against her body, she moved quickly but unhurriedly toward the livery where Thunder waited. Ruby reached the livery stable just as church bells began tolling across town, not the measured rings marking the hour, but the urgent pealing that signaled emergency. Her carefully constructed plan was unraveling. Either Silas and Travis had been captured or worse, betrayed her. No time to speculate. She needed to move. The stable boy barely glanced up as she approached Thunder's stall. "Leaving so soon, ma'am? Thought you were staying for the judge's funeral." "Change of plans," Ruby replied, keeping her voice soft and bereaved as she quickly saddled Thunder. The stallion sensed her urgency, standing unusually still as she worked. Within minutes, they were heading out the back of the stable, avoiding the main streets where deputies would be searching. Ruby had nearly reached the eastern edge of town when gunfire erupted in the distance. Sharp, staccato reports echoing. Between buildings, the mining shack, Silas and Travis were making their stand. Decision time. The evidence was secure in her possession. The logical choice was to ride hard for Tucson, deliver the documentation to Marshal Coleman, and let justice take its course. But logic had never been what drove Ruby Callahan. With a swift, practiced movement, she discarded the widow's dress, revealing practical riding clothes beneath. The matched peacemakers found their familiar places in her hands. Thunder responded instantly to the subtle pressure of her knees, wheeling toward the gunfire and breaking into a gallop. The old mining shack stood on a barren rise half a mile outside town. As Ruby approached, the tactical situation became clear. Davis's men had surrounded the structure, pouring suppressing fire through its few windows. Inside, Silas and Travis were returning fire sporadically, clearly conserving ammunition. No sign of Davis himself. Had he escaped in the confusion? Been killed? The question became secondary as Ruby focused on the immediate threat to her companions. The deputies were so intent on the shack, they failed to notice her approach until it was too late. Ruby burst from the scrub brush like an avenging spirit. Thunder's hooves thundering across the hard-packed earth, her peacemakers blazing. She wasn't shooting to kill. Precise shots kicked up dirt near deputies' feet, splintered wood beside heads, shattered weapons in startled hands. The sudden onslaught from an unexpected direction created instant chaos. "It's the Phantom Rose!" someone shouted, triggering a wave of panic. The name still carried power. A legend made flesh, the ghost that left roses on dead men's chests. 2. Deputies broke cover and ran. Others returned fire, bullets whizzing harmlessly past as Ruby maneuvered Thunder in an unpredictable pattern, never presenting a stationary target. From the shack, renewed gunfire erupted as Silas and Travis seized the opportunity. Caught in crossfire, more deputies scrambled for better positions or simply fled. Ruby reached the shack's rear wall, dismounting in a fluid motion and slapping Thunder's flank to send him to safety. "Silas!" she called. "Travis!" Still breathing. Silas's voice responded from inside. "Davis double-crossed us, managed to work free of his bindings while we were setting up perimeter." Ruby cursed under her breath. Davis had likely been playing possum, appearing weaker than he actually was. Waiting for his moment. Where is he now? "Headed toward town with 2 deputies, Travis replied, firing another shot through a broken window. "Left the rest to finish us." Ruby calculated rapidly. Davis would warn Morrison's remaining organization. Her evidence would become meaningless. If they mobilized their full resources, judges could be bribed, witnesses intimidated, documents destroyed. "Cover me," she ordered, checking her ammunition. "I'm going after Davis." Neither man argued. They'd come to respect her determination, and perhaps understood that this moment, 5 years in the making, belonged to her alone. "We'll hold them here," Silas confirmed. "Buy you time." With a nod of acknowledgement, Ruby slipped around the shack's corner, staying low as she moved from cover to cover. Most of the deputies remained focused on the shack, unaware that their true target had escaped their cordon. Thunder appeared at her whistle, seemingly materializing from nowhere as he had been trained to do. Ruby swung into the saddle and turned him toward town, toward Davis, toward the final reckoning. She caught sight of them as they reached the outskirts of Copper Springs, Davis on a borrowed horse, two deputies flanking him protectively. The marshal's posture betrayed his still weakened condition, but determination drove him forward just as surely as it drove Ruby. "Davis!" she called, her voice carrying across the open ground between them. All three men turned, reaching for weapons, but only Ruby fired. The first shot struck the ground before the deputies' horses, causing both animals to rear in panic. The second shot was more precise, a perfect disarmament that sent Davis's revolver spinning from his grasp without drawing blood. "Ruby Callahan!" Davis shouted, recognizing her now without the widow's disguise. "It's over! You're surrounded!" Ruby advanced steadily, one peacemaker trained on Davis, the other covering the deputies who struggled to control their frightened mounts. "It is over," she agreed calmly, "but not for me." She patted the documentation secured in her vest pocket. "I have everything, Clayton. Every piece of evidence my father collected. Morrison might be dead, but his organization will fall, and you'll hang for what you did." Davis's face contorted with desperate fury. "Kill her!" he screamed to his deputies. Neither man moved. Something in Ruby's deadly calm, in the precision of her earlier shots, kept them frozen in place. They were ordinary deputies, not hardened killers like their marshal. They recognized death when it stared them in the face. "Smart decision," Ruby acknowledged, then addressed them directly. "Your marshal conspired with Judge Morrison to frame and murder my father, Sheriff Thomas Callahan. I have proof of their crimes, proof I'm taking to Territorial Marshal Coleman in Tucson." "She's lying," Davis interjected frantically. "She's a wanted killer, the Phantom Rose." "Yes," Ruby admitted without hesitation. "I've killed 14 men, each one complicit in my father's murder, each one given the chance to confess before they died." Her eyes locked with Davis's. "You'll be the exception, Clayton. You get to face a real judge, a real jury. You get what my father never received, justice under the law." The town had gone strangely quiet. The funeral procession for Judge Morrison had emerged onto the main street, a solemn line of black-clad mourners now frozen in tableau as they witnessed the confrontation. Among them, Ruby recognized faces from her childhood, businessmen who had dined at her father's table, council members who had approved his appointment as sheriff, ordinary citizens who had stood silent as he was marched to the gallows. In that moment, it wasn't just Davis facing judgment, but the entire town. "My father was innocent," Ruby announced, her voice carrying to the assembled crowd. "Judge Morrison framed him to protect a criminal empire. I have the proof." She patted her vest again. Every piece of evidence he collected before his arrest, bank records, witness statements, Morrison's own correspondence ordering his death. Davis made his move then, a desperate lunge toward one of his deputies, seeking to seize the man's weapon. Ruby's reaction was instantaneous, her peacemaker barking once. The marshal collapsed with a cry, clutching his leg where her bullet had struck, the same shoulder wound he had given Ruby's father years ago during his arrest. "That's for my father," Ruby stated coldly. "The rest is for the law to decide." Movement from the crowd drew her attention. A distinguished man in a black suit was approaching cautiously, hands raised to show he carried no weapon. "Miss Callahan," he called. "I'm Edward Pierce, federal prosecutor. I was sent to investigate irregularities in Judge Morrison's court." He gestured to the portfolio visible in her vest. "If what you say is true, I'd very much like to see that evidence." Ruby studied him cautiously, then nodded toward the deputies. "Keep him secured," she instructed, indicating Davis. "The evidence goes directly to Territorial Marshal Coleman. No intermediaries," Pierce nodded understanding. "I've worked with Coleman for years. Let me help you reach him safely." He turned to the stunned funeral gathering. "Is there a doctor present? The marshal needs medical attention before his transfer to Tucson." The confrontation was transforming. Politics and procedure replacing gunfire and threats. Ruby felt a strange sensation washing over her, part relief, part disbelief, that the moment she had lived for was finally unfolding. From the direction of the mining shack, she saw Silas and Travis approaching cautiously, having apparently dealt with the remaining deputies. Their expressions showed equal parts wariness and triumph as they took in the scene. "Miss Callahan," Pierce addressed her again, "I understand your caution, but I give you my word as an officer of the federal court. Justice will be served here, today." Ruby looked from the prosecutor to Davis, still writhing in pain on the ground, to the townspeople watching in stunned silence. 5 years of hiding, hunting, living as the phantom rose, all for this moment. "Justice," she echoed softly. Then with deliberate movements, she holstered one peacemaker and reached into her vest, withdrawing her father's documentation. "This is everything. Names, dates, transactions. Morrison wasn't just corrupt. He built an empire on stolen land and murdered anyone who threatened to expose him." As Pierce accepted the portfolio, Ruby felt a weight lifting, not just the physical burden of the documents, but the heavier load she had carried since watching her father hang. Thomas Callahan was a good man, she stated, loudly enough for all to hear. A good sheriff. He deserved better from the people he protected. Her eyes swept across the gathered townsfolk, many of whom looked away in shame. "Remember that when you bury Judge Morrison today." 3 days later, Ruby stood on the boarding house porch in Tucson, watching the morning activity in the territorial capital. The town bustled with purpose, so different from the stunned silence that had enveloped Copper Springs after Davis's arrest. Territorial Marshal Coleman approached, his weathered face serious beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Miss Callahan," he greeted her, joining her at the railing. "Just received word from the federal prosecutor. Davis has agreed to testify against Morrison's entire organization in exchange for his life." Ruby nodded, unsurprised. "Clayton always was a survivor." "Your father would be proud," Coleman said quietly. "His evidence, combined with Davis's testimony, it's already bringing down men who thought themselves untouchable." The mention of her father brought a familiar tightness to Ruby's chest, but also something new, a sense of completion that had been absent for 5 long years. "What happens now?" she asked. "To me?" Coleman sighed deeply. "That's complicated. The Phantom Rose is wanted for 14 killings. 14 men who deserve justice," Ruby countered evenly. "Perhaps," Coleman acknowledged, "but vigilante justice isn't something the law can simply overlook, no matter how justified." Before Ruby could respond, the boarding house door opened and Silas emerged, nodding respectfully to the marshal. Travis followed close behind, his young face showing the strain of recent events, but also a new steadiness of purpose. "The judge is ready to see us," Silas announced. Inside the territorial courthouse, Judge Franklin Hargrove, specially appointed to handle the sensitive case, regarded Ruby with thoughtful eyes. As the impromptu hearing concluded, he removed his spectacles and spoke directly to her. "Miss Callahan, the court recognizes the extraordinary circumstances surrounding your actions. While I cannot condone vigilante justice, I also cannot ignore the systematic corruption that denied your father due process." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "In light of your cooperation and the evidence you've provided, I'm suspending any prosecution for past actions attributed to the Phantom Rose, conditional upon your abandonment of that identity." Relief washed through Ruby, though she kept her expression controlled. "Thank you, Your Honor." "Don't thank me yet," the judge cautioned. "This arrangement comes with conditions. You'll remain under Marshal Coleman's supervision for 2 years. Any return to vigilante activities will result in immediate prosecution for all past offenses. It was more than Ruby had dared hope for. Not full exoneration, but a chance to reclaim her life, to step out of the shadows. As they left the courthouse, Travis approached her hesitantly. "What will you do now?" Ruby considered the question. For so long, her existence had been defined by a single purpose. Now, with that purpose fulfilled, possibilities stretched before her like an uncharted landscape. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "My ranch is probably lost. Don't think I can go back to Copper Springs anyway." "Could go anywhere," Silas observed, joining them. "Fresh start." The idea held appeal, leaving behind the territory that had taken so much from her, finding somewhere her name and story weren't known. Yet something in her resisted the notion of simply disappearing. "My father used to say a good sheriff doesn't run from problems," she said slowly. "Stays and fixes them." Coleman, overhearing as he descended the courthouse steps, nodded approval. Territory could use more people with that philosophy, especially now, with Morrison's organization being dismantled, creates opportunities for honest folk to reclaim what was stolen. The marshal hesitated, then added more quietly, "Thomas Callahan trained you well, in more ways than gunmanship. Territory's short on people with both skill and integrity. If you're interested in legitimate work—" Ruby looked at him with surprise. "Are you offering me a job, Marshal?" "Deputy position," Coleman confirmed. "Under my supervision, as the judge ordered. Use those tracking skills for the law instead of outside it." The offer hung in the air, unexpected, yet somehow fitting. After a moment, Ruby nodded slowly. "I'll consider it." As Coleman departed, Silas regarded Ruby with something approaching respect. "Deputy Callahan," he mused, "has a certain irony to it." "What about you two?" Ruby asked. "Still heading for Mexico?" Travis exchanged glances with Silas before answering. "Judge offered me amnesty in exchange for testimony about prison conditions at Yuma. Thinking I might take it, start fresh. Here in the territory," Silas shrugged noncommittally. "Mexico's waited this long. Might stick around, see how things develop with Morrison's empire crumbling. Could be opportunities for a man with my particular skills." "Legal opportunities, I hope," Ruby cautioned. Though without her former coldness, Silas merely smiled enigmatically. "We'll see." Later that evening, Ruby stood alone in her boarding house room, her father's pocket watch open in her palm. For 5 years, she had carried it as a reminder of justice denied. Now its steady ticking seemed to speak of something else. Time. Continuing, life continuing. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Travis stood in the hallway, awkward but determined. "Wanted to say goodbye properly," he explained. "I'm heading north tomorrow. Heard about work at a horse ranch outside Prescott." Ruby studied him, this young man who had begun their acquaintance as an escaped convict, but had proven to be something more. "Good luck," she offered sincerely. "You've earned a second chance." Travis hesitated, then spoke with quiet intensity. "What you did, exposing Morrison, clearing your father's name, it matters. Makes me think maybe the law can work after all, if the right people stand behind it." His words touched something in Ruby, articulating what she had been feeling since the courthouse. Her father had believed in the law, had died for it. Perhaps honoring his memory meant not just avenging his death, but carrying forward his principles. "Maybe." "You're right," she acknowledged. "Maybe that's the real legacy." As Travis prepared to leave, he paused in the doorway. "Whatever you decide, deputy, rancher, something else entirely, you're more than the Phantom Rose now. You're Ruby Callahan again." After he departed, Ruby returned to the window, watching night settle over Tucson. For the first time in years, she looked toward the future rather than the past. The Phantom Rose had completed her mission. Now Ruby Callahan could begin hers. 1 month later, Ruby rode Thunder along the territorial road outside Tucson, the silver deputy's badge catching the morning sunlight. The weight of it felt strange against her vest. Official, legitimate, a symbol of the path she had chosen. Marshal. Coleman had been true to his word. The position challenged her skills without constraining her independence too severely. Most importantly, it gave purpose to abilities honed through years of surviving as the phantom rose. She rained Thunder, too, a stop atop a rise overlooking a small cemetery on the outskirts of town. Dismounting, she approached a fresh grave, recently marked with a proper headstone to replace the crude wooden marker it had borne for 5 years. Sheriff Thomas Callahan, servant of the law, defender of justice. Vindicated Ruby placed a single rose, not dried but fresh and vibrant, on her father's grave. "It's done," she said simply. "They know the truth now." A horse's approach drew her attention. Travis McCoy rode toward her, his appearance much changed from the desperate escaped convict she had first encountered. Clean-shaven, properly dressed, he looked like the honest ranch hand he had become. "Marshal Coleman said I might find you." "Here," he explained, dismounting nearby. "Wanted to let you know I'm heading north tomorrow." "Got that permanent position at the Prescott Ranch?" Ruby nodded approval. "You'll do well there." An awkward silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. They had shared dangers that created a bond not easily defined or dismissed. "Heard about your first official case," Travis finally said. "Tracking down those rustlers outside Benson. 4 men, and you brought them all in alive. Impressive." "Just doing the job," Ruby replied, though a hint of pride colored her voice. "Your father's way," Travis observed quietly. "Yes." She looked back at the grave. "Turns out revenge isn't what brings peace. It's knowing you're carrying forward what matters." As they mounted their horses to leave, Travis hesitated. "I'll be back this way in a few months. Supply run for the ranch." The invitation in his words remained unspoken but clear. Ruby found herself nodding. "I'll be here." They rode together to the crossroads where their paths would diverge. Travis, north to Prescott, Ruby back to her duties in Tucson. At the junction, they paused one final time. "The legend of the Phantom Rose is already fading," Travis remarked. "Soon it'll just be another frontier tale, something folks tell around campfires." "Good," Ruby replied. "Some ghosts should be allowed to rest." She extended her hand and Travis took it. A gesture between equals, between 2 people who had seen each other at their most vulnerable and most determined. As they parted ways, Ruby felt Thunder shift eagerly beneath her, sensing her lightened spirit. The road ahead stretched clear and open, no longer shadowed by the past. Ruby Callahan, once the most feared gunslinger in the West, nudged her stallion forward into a new day. Not as a phantom seeking vengeance, but as a woman reclaiming her rightful place in the world her father had died protecting.